Think your tap water's sketchy. In the Middle Ages, a sip could summon demon's disease or your last breath. Forget sharks. Back then the real terror was the bathtub. Think your roommate's pile of laundry is a health hazard? Imagine living in a world where washing your hands might get you killed. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where hygiene was a fantasy, water was suspicious, and smelling like a goat's armpit was practically a religious virtue. This wasn't just about being too lazy to bathe. People were genuinely afraid that cleaning themselves would invite disease, death, or worse, sinful pleasure. Yes, in a time of plagues and pitchforks, soap was more terrifying than Satan. From the moment a medieval baby slid out of the womb, usually in a dirt floor cottage surrounded by livestock and illiteracy, the countdown to grime began. Newborns weren't cleaned the way we'd expect today. Forget gentle wipes and herbal lotions. If anything, a handful of cold water, if any water, was slapped onto the infant before they were tightly wrapped in layers of cloth and left to stew in their own biology. Welcome to your new life, kid. You're marinated from day one. Now let's talk about the elephant in the medieval room, the fear of water. Not the fear of drowning, although plenty did that too, but the belief that washing the body opened up pores which were considered gateways to all sorts of invisible demons and diseases. The logic was simple: dirt sealed the body, water unsealed it. So while you're out there scrubbing your face with activated charcoal and exfoliating like your pores hold national secrets, medieval folks were basically trying to become human calluses. The filthier you were, the safer you felt. And you know who really pushed this idea, doctors? Well, doctors in the sense that they wore bird masks stuffed with herbs and blamed astrology for your diarrhea. These guys, often monks or barbers with bloodletting kits, believed in the humours theory that your health depended on balancing black bile, yellow bile, blood and phlegm. Hygiene didn't fit into that equation. In fact, many of them warned against frequent bathing because it was thought to weaken the body or cause excess moisture. That's right, being too clean was medically irresponsible. If you're imagining this only applied to poor peasants, allow me to ruin your royal fantasies. Even nobility considered cleanliness suspicious. Take Queen Isabella of Castile, yes, a literal monarch who famously claimed to have only bathed twice in her entire life, once at birth and once before her wedding. That's not a punchline. That's royal policy. Courtly elegance came with flowing gowns, powdered wigs, and the kind of BO that could knock out a bear. Kings had perfume, peasants had mud, neither had soap. Let's pause here and reflect. You probably took a shower today, or at least I hope you did. In the Middle Ages, that alone would have made you look like a lunatic or worse, a heretic. Imagine walking into a medieval village, freshly bathed hair slicked back, smelling like lavender and citrus. They wouldn't admire your hygiene. They'd assume you were either a witch, a demon, or French, possibly all three. Cleanliness wasn't just rare, it was untrustworthy. And yes, there was soap. Kind of. It was a chunky mixture of lard ashes and regret. Rougher than sandpaper, smellier than compost, and about as pleasant as washing with meat. Most people didn't even bother with it unless they were laundering clothes or had a sudden, inexplicable urge to exfoliate down to the bone. Some soap makers were even considered outcast, partly because of the stench, partly because their profession flirted with suspicious modernity. Scrubbing away sin was fine in sermons, but not in real life. But wait, it gets grosser. You know how your skin gets flaky if you don't moisturize for a few days? Medieval people considered that flakiness a sign of health. Dead skin meant your body was adjusting to the weather, peeling like a croissant perfect. As long as nothing was oozing, bleeding, or actively falling off, most people just let nature do its crusty thing. It was a time when being clean was unnatural, and being crusty was culture. Now let's talk about clothes. Clean body, no. Clean clothes, Maybe, but mostly no. Shirts were rarely washed and often slept in for weeks at a time. Underwear, if it existed, was changed with the frequency of solar eclipses. Many people owned 1 or 2 garments for the entire year. If you had a stain, congratulations, it now had sentimental value. Some tried to combat odours with dried flowers sewn into their sleeves. Others just gave up and learned to live in a fragrant fog of sweat smoke and seasonal cheese. And then there were lice. Not the metaphorical kind you cut out of your life, we're talking armies of literal head and body lice. These weren't shameful. They were part of the furniture. People even had little tools called Enit combs and played grooming games to see who could collect the most. Picking lice was considered bonding, the closest thing to a spa day. So next time your friend says let's do self-care, be grateful it doesn't involve delousing each other by candlelight. And oh, bathing did happen occasionally, usually in summer when rivers were warm and bodies were already rotting in the water. If you were wealthy, you might have a wooden tub which got filled once for the whole household. First up Dad, then Mom, then the kids, then the baby. By the end you were bathing in a brownish soup that smelled like tired meat. Hence the phrase, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because yes, you could actually lose a baby in that murky abyss. Bathhouses existed, 2 public ones, but they quickly turned into hotbeds of diseased sexual activity and accusations of witchcraft. The church began to frown on them, and soon enough the idea of stripping down for cleanliness became synonymous with moral decay. If someone insisted on bathing too much, people didn't say, wow, they're so fresh. They said, what are they hiding? Or worse, are they trying to seduce me with their visible neck? The irony. Despite being surrounded by all this filth, people still judged each other's smells. Bad breath was considered a spiritual issue. Sweaty armpits were masculine, and feet. If your feet smelled too clean, you were clearly not working hard enough. This was a society where body odour was interpreted like a horoscope. It told people your profession, your diet, and your sins. Smelling good was suspicious. Smelling terrible was honest. And just to twist the dagger of absurdity even deeper, people thought cleaning could kill you but filth could protect you. Dirt was believed to create a protective barrier against illness. People smeared their bodies with oils, fats, even crushed herbs not to clean themselves but to create a layer between skin and evil. Imagine slathering on pig fat every morning to stay safe and still dying of dysentery. The Middle Ages, where every health tip ended in diarrhea, even doctors joined the nonsense. Some advised against washing hands after using the toilet because the water might drive disease into your fingertips. Surgeons, if you could call them that, often operated with unwashed hands and rusty knives. The concept of sterilization didn't exist. They believed infections were caused by bad air, not poop-covered fingers slicing into your spleen. But hey, at least they had leeches. So what happened when someone did try to be clean? They got sick. Why? Because they didn't understand how germs worked. Someone would finally bathe, get exposed to real pathogens hiding in the clean water, and then die 2 days later of typhoid. Conclusion. Bathing. Guessed. Death. Logic. Not necessary. It was the ultimate lose-lose stay, dirty and stink or get clean and perish. Honestly, it's amazing the species made it. The cherry on this mouldy cake, filth wasn't just tolerated, it was weaponized. Castles had murder holes where boiling sewage could be poured on attackers. Peasants used dung to seal their houses and fertilize everything. Some even used cow urine as a disinfectant. Yes, you heard that right, pee was medicine. It was also shampoo. So if you're feeling bad about using 3 different kinds of body wash, just remember, at least you're not rinsing with livestock fluids. So you've braved medieval life without soap-skipped showers to avoid death and walked around with the confidence of a crusty saint. But eventually even the filthiest soul felt the itch literally and spiritually to do something resembling bathing. Enter the communal bathhouse, that seductive, steamy little lie society told itself to feel clean. Sounds relaxing, right? Just imagine a spa where everyone's naked, coughing and potentially rotting from the inside. Welcome to the stew of naked diseases, Tem. Bathhouses in medieval Europe weren't exclusive to the elite. They were open to the sweaty masses, peasants, merchants, knights, and people who hadn't changed their underwear since the last pope. For the cost of a few coins, you could strip down, squeeze into a wooden tub with strangers and stew in water that hadn't been changed since the Crusades. The ambiance somewhere between a humid soup kitchen and a public orgy, and the smell biblical. And don't let the flickering candles and herbal steam fool you. These places weren't sanitary. They were hotbeds of infection, both literal and metaphorical. The water was never replaced between customers. Instead, more hot water was poured in to freshen it up, like topping off a toilet bowl with soup stock. Skin flakes open, wounds, pus from boils, and lice floated casually on the surface like croutons in a broth of biological warfare. Now let's talk about what people actually did in these bathhouses. Sure, some just sat and soaked, but others got a little interactive. Bathing quickly became a social activity, a place to gossip, eat, play dice, and yes, hook up. Imagine trying to unwind in your own filth, while the guy next to you loudly negotiates a chicken trade, and someone's getting a handsy back rub in the corner. If you didn't leave with lice, you probably left with secrets or syphilis. By the late 1300s, bathhouses had such a raunchy reputation that moralists and clergymen began calling them portals to perdition. And they weren't entirely wrong. Many bathhouses operated as unofficial brothels. You'd walk in for a rinse and leave with an STI or worse, a new confession to make. The church tried banning them repeatedly, but the public kept crawling back itchy, infected, and too horny to care. It wasn't hygiene. It was hygiene-adjacent sin with bubbles. But don't get the idea, this was all reckless hedonism. No, there were rules. Men and women often bathed separately, at least on paper. Some bathhouses had gendered hours, some had curtains, and some just gave up and let people stew together like dumplings. In cities like Paris and Prague, entire bathhouse neighbourhoods existed complete with innuendos and coded signs. One famous German bathhouse even advertised clean skin and warmer nights. Subtle. Oh, and let's not forget the tools of the trade. Bath attendants, known as bathers, were part masseuse, part pseudo-doctor, part infection vector. They'd scrub your skin with brushes so rough they'd double as medieval sandpaper. Then they'd lather you in questionable herbs, oils, or even sulphur paste, because nothing says luxury like smelling like a volcano. Bathers also offered services like bloodletting and minor surgery. Imagine going in for a steam and leaving with a missing molar and tetanus. What about the decor, you ask? Picture this dark timber wall, slick with condensation steam so thick it doubled as a fog machine, and candles flickering over vats of lukewarm disease. Floors were perpetually wet, slippery with soap scum and body grease. Towels, if they existed, were shared. And if someone coughed or worse sneezed across the room, congratulations, you just inhaled 14th century pneumonia. You weren't bathing in water, you were marinating in medieval regret. Bathhouses didn't just attract humans. Rats, fleas, and the occasional frog also frequented the damp corners, creating a sort of Noah's Ark of pestilence. But nobody cared. In a world where clean drinking water was a hallucination, and soap was the devil's invention, bathhouses were the closest thing to a spa day, if that spa also doubled as an underground gladiator arena for bacteria. And it was addictive. People kept going back because for 5 glorious minutes you didn't smell like despair. And then the Black Death happened. When the plague hit Europe in the mid-1300s, everything changed, including bathhouses. people realised that these warm, wet social spaces were also great for spreading the Yersinia pestis welcome wagon. Steam couldn't kill bacteria, but it sure helped them mingle, and while some folks blamed fleas, many believed the real culprit was, of course, water. Clean or not, water was now considered a plague highway. Bathhouses shut down or burned, sometimes with people still inside. Medieval crowd control was direct, but the damage was already done. Bathhouses had been exposed for what they were: cesspools of germs, gossip and gonorrhea. Cities that once had dozens of them became barren. The rich started building private bathing rooms, read one-person plague chambers, and the poor just gave up entirely and went back to the safety of stink. The age of semi-public cleaning was over. The age of crusty loneliness had begun. You might wonder, did anyone at the time realise how bad it all was? Some did. A few monks and scholars wrote grim notes about bathhouses being dens of vice and infection. One even described the water as the colour of despair. But most people lacking germ theory and dignity just accepted it. It was tradition. A weird, naked, disease-riddled tradition that smelled like mildew and regret, but still tradition. Let's pause and imagine this for a moment. Picture walking into your neighbourhood spa expecting eucalyptus oil and Enya music, only to find 15 half-naked strangers screaming about taxes, sharing a bloodletting knife, and casually contracting syphilis in the shallow end. That's not a horror story, it's Thursday in medieval Germany. The truth is, people didn't just fear water. They feared what water revealed. Once the grime washed off, you were vulnerable, exposed, soft, and in a world full of sharp things that was terrifying. So bathhouses became places where people confronted mortality while pretending to clean up. A warm tub, a warm body, and a cold, creeping fear of the next sneeze. That was hygiene. Ironically, some doctors began noticing patterns. Patients who frequented bathhouses tended to get sick more often. But instead of blaming the filthy water or crusty towels, they blamed the act of bathing itself. Because clearly the problem wasn't the rat-filled stew of pus and sweat, it was you trying to clean your armpits. The logic: if you feel sick after a bath, stop bathing. Problem solved. Science medieval style. Eventually bathhouses fell out of favour almost entirely. Some were converted into bakeries or warehouses. Others became brothels officially, since they already operated that way. And a few turned into ruins, standing as moss-covered monuments to mankind's noble attempt to fight filth with more filth. They were the Middle Ages version of health clubs, sweaty, overpriced, filled with shame, and probably giving you something nasty. But here's the punchline in all this chaos: medieval people still believed they were making progress. They saw bathhouses as modern, even enlightened. They thought they were innovating hygiene. And in a way they were just without the results. They had the ambition of a clean society paired with the scientific knowledge of a potato. A valiant effort foiled by human fluids and superstition. So the next time you're lounging in a pristine jacuzzi sipping cucumber water and pretending your stress is melting away, just remember somewhere in a candlelit medieval shack, 12 people were doing the exact same thing. Naked, coughing, contracting things with names like Plague of the Groin. You're living their dream, except you won't die from it. Probably. Modern humans like to argue over whether to drink almond milk, oat milk, or water infused with cucumber slices grown under moonlight. In the Middle Ages, the argument was more like, would you rather die of dysentery or go blind from ale poisoning? Because drinking water back then wasn't refreshing, it was a gamble. A watery roulette of bacteria, floating mystery bits, and possibly the finger of a drowned baker. In medieval Europe, if you drank water, you were either desperate or very new to town. The rivers were your main source of hydration. If by hydration you mean ingesting a slurry of sewage-rotting animal parts, dead fish, and whatever the local butcher dumped out at sunset. Towns used rivers as drinking sources, bathing spots, laundromats, garbage disposals, and toilets, all at once. So yeah, when someone offered you water, it came with a bouquet of smells, a touch of typhoid, and maybe a new parasite to name after your cousin. Bottoms up. People didn't call it pollution, they called it normal. Imagine watching your neighbour poop in the stream, then walking downstream to fill your cup. And if you mentioned it was, disgusting, they'd laugh at you like you were some snobby clean freak. Oh, look at Sir Fancy Guts, too good for river floaties. There wasn't even a word for clean in some dialects, it was just less filthy. Life was a constant race to stay one mouthful ahead of infection. Now let's introduce beer. Beautiful, golden, life-saving beer. Not the fun party kind, we're talking medieval beer. The murky porridge-like beverage people chugged from sunrise to collapse because it was safer than water. The alcohol killed off most of the pathogens, and the boiling process made it drinkable. Sure, it was weak sour and occasionally had bits of bread floating in it, but at least it didn't come with cholera as a chaser. Kids drank beer. Pregnant women drank beer. Monks drank so much beer they considered it a vegetable. And don't romanticize the brewing process. Beer wasn't made by smiling villagers in clean aprons. It was made in wooden tubs crusted with old yeast by people who believed that frogs falling into the mix was just nature's spice. Some recipes called for soot or stale bread. Others accidentally fermented with wild herbs that caused hallucinations. So yes, water could kill you, but beer could kill you while making you think you were flying. Options, people. Even when wells became more common, they were still hit or miss. A well could be clean today, then turning into a death pit tomorrow after someone tossed a dead goat in it. There were no safety inspections, no water filters, no Brita, just blind trust and crossed fingers. Some towns believed in placing holy relics near wells to purify them. Nothing like a few saintly bones to spice up your morning hydration, because when science fails, bring in the corpses. In cities, water carriers became a common profession. Their job, fetch clean water and deliver it to your house for a fee. And by clean we mean less chunky. They filled barrels from sources slightly less gross than usual, but guess what they used to transport it? Old animal skins, or leaky wooden buckets held together by prayers and fungus. So even if the water started out decent by the time it reached your mouth, it had done a full tour of medieval biohazards. Let's not forget snow. During winter, some communities collected snow or ice for water, melted it, drank it. Sounds pure right. Except snow often landed on roofs covered in bird droppings and chimney soot. By spring, you weren't drinking glacial purity. You were sipping pigeon diarrhea slush. Romantic. Some of the more advanced regions tried aqueducts and water pipes, but even these were far from reliable. Pipes were made of lead because back then the concept of lead poisoning was filed under mysterious acts of God. So if you were rich enough to afford piped water, congratulations, you had indoor lead poisoning. Plus the pipes often leaked into cesspits or caught rat infestations mid-flow. Basically, drinking water was an exercise in optimism or untreated trauma. Now let's talk about the taste. Oh yes. Medieval water had flavour. It ranged from stagnant pond to barnyard nightmare depending on the day. People tried masking it by adding herbs, honey or wine, or just not breathing through their nose. Sometimes they even chewed garlic beforehand so the water tasted less offensive, which means the water was so bad they weaponized their own breath as a distraction. And still water was unavoidable. You needed it to cook clean rarely and brew that precious survival beer. So what did they do? They developed rituals around it. Boiling water became a luxury. Collecting rainwater was considered smart unless, of course, it was the kind of rain that picked up every disease particle in the town's air and delivered it into your barrel like a sweet wet curse. Let's just say nobody had a Pinterest-worthy kitchen sink. One particularly fun trick was letting water settle. That meant you poured it into a jar, waited for the visible particles to sink to the bottom, and drank the top part. In theory. In practice, it just meant drinking the upper layer of a rot smoothie while pretending the bottom didn't exist. And if someone got sick, people didn't blame the water. They blamed witches' bad luck, or the alignment of Saturn, because obviously Saturn is why your intestines are melting. There were also myths about healing springs and magic waters that could cure disease. Spoiler, they couldn't. People bathed in them, drank from them, and died anyway. But medieval marketing was strong. If someone told you a spring-heeled cousin Bernard's boils, you went. You drank. You boiled your foot. And if you survived, you called it a miracle. If you didn't, well, you died hydrated. Holy water now with bonus parasites. Animals didn't help either. Livestock shared water sources with people. Cows waded into wells. Pigs bathed in ponds. Dogs probably peed into every wooden bucket. But nobody drew a line. It was all just water. Water was communal. Water was family. Water was a bacterial orgy. And the weirdest part, people didn't complain. They didn't know how bad it was because bad was just the starting point. Worse was the daily goal. And yet here's the kicker, they kept drinking it. Because what else could they do? Boiling took too long. Beer only worked for those who had grains. So they swallowed their fear and whatever else floated by. Some added chalk to reduce the taste. Others drank through cloth. One medieval text even suggested filtering water through a holy hat. That's right, a hat blessed by a priest. May your thirst be quenched and your liver forgiven. It's no wonder that getting the runs was a daily event. Medieval texts mention diarrhea the way we talk about the weather. Fair skies, good wheat, and 3 days of gastrointestinal betrayal. There were no electrolytes, no toilet paper, and no sympathy. If you were lucky, you recovered. If you weren't, you shat yourself to death. Either way, it was probably the water's fault, and nobody did anything to change it. Because to change it meant admitting water was dangerous, and that was too terrifying to accept. So yes, water was terrifying. Not in the mystical way, but in the real-life crawl-out-of-your-butt kind of way. It killed people slowly and visibly and constantly. It looked innocent. It felt necessary, and it betrayed everyone. Honestly, it was the medieval version of that one friend who always says, "Trust me," right before everything explodes. Water was that friend. Only thirstier. But here's the final absurd twist in times of drought. People prayed for water. Entire communities held processions, begged saints, and sobbed for rain. Because even poisonous water was better than none. Even death water had value. Because in the Middle Ages, fear and desperation shared the same glass. Cheers. So far, we've established that medieval people feared water more than they feared public speaking. And for good reason, because drinking it could kill you. Bathing in it could kill you. And even looking at it sideways might invite some sort of rash. But what if I told you they found one exception? One kind of water they not only embraced but practically worshipped, enter holy water, blessed by the church, sprinkled with piety, and of course absolutely teeming with plague juice. Holy water was considered the spiritual Swiss Army knife of the medieval world. Need protection from demons. Sprinkle holy water. Trying to heal that nasty leg sore that smells like regret. Rub some holy water on it. Your crop's dying. Holy water. Child sneezing. Holy water. Flatulence that sounds suspiciously like heresy. Drench that sinner. It was the medieval version of a Windex from my big fat Greek wedding. One vial fits all. The church handed it out like Oprah handed out cars. You get a blessing. You get a blessing. And you Yes, you with the boils definitely need a double dose. Now let's break this down. Holy water was created by a priest reciting blessings over a basin of regular, unfiltered, suspiciously brown water, often taken from the same barrel the altar boy had washed his feet in earlier. Then it was stored in fonts, those little basins at the entrance of churches where the devout would dip their fingers and cross themselves. Lovely tradition, except when you realise that everyone dipped into that same bowl daily, with fingers that had probably just wiped a nose, patted a cow, or committed some light blasphemy. It wasn't a font, it was a petri dish in disguise. Did they clean the font? Oh, you sweet, naive, modern creature. Of course not. Cleaning it would have been seen as doubting the holiness. Because if the water had been blessed, it couldn't possibly carry disease right wrong. Turns out divine protection doesn't come with a health inspection. In fact, in plague-stricken towns, the holy water font was often the first place people contracted the Black Death. A single infected finger dip and bam, half the choir's dead by Sunday. And still, people clung to it. Because holy water wasn't just sacred, it was theological insurance. Even if it didn't heal your flesh wound, it might scrub your soul clean. And if you died, hey, at least you died pious and wet. That counted for something, right? The church said so. The same church, by the way, that also sold indulgences and warned that bathing too often might turn you into a sex demon. But we're not here to judge, just to laugh and cry and gag a little. Let's talk about the exorcism potential of holy water. It wasn't just for polite blessings, it was a full-on anti-demon artillery. Priests flung it at people during exorcisms like it was spiritual pepper spray. Did someone sneeze suspiciously loud during mass holy water? Did a woman speak her mind a little too freely holy water and possibly fire? They believed it could purify anything, the body, the mind, your possibly cursed sheep, even haunted cheese. And if it didn't work, that just meant you needed more water, or a burning stake. Of course, the richer churches upped the drama. Some cathedrals stored holy water in massive stone fonts the size of bathtubs. Fancy ones were made of marble adorned with angels' gargoyles and suspicious smells. On high holy days, priests walked the aisles, flicking water onto the congregation with a brush or a silver wand. People leaned in eagerly to be splashed, because nothing says divine grace like being misted with a stranger's elbow water from a bucket that hasn't been emptied since Easter. Amen. And then there were the holy wells, natural springs believed to be touched by saints' angels or bored medieval marketing teams. Pilgrims travelled for days, sometimes barefoot, just to sip from a hole in the ground next to a shrine. They believed it cured everything. Blindness, boils, even stupidity, though the last one had a pretty low success rate. These places became so popular that some towns built entire economies around them. Locals sold trinkets, bottled miracle water, and told stories like St. Cuthbert once sneezed here and cured 1,000 lepers. Spoiler, he didn't. Did these wells help? Probably not. Most were contaminated, overused, and full of bacteria even God didn't recognize. But faith is a powerful thing, especially when your other options include leech therapy prayers in Latin you don't understand or dying at 27 with your pants made of hay. If someone said a spring might cure your gout, you drank it even if it also cured your ability to keep down solids, because at least you tried, and trying meant hope. Hope and diarrhea. Let's not forget the travelling salesmen of the sacred splash relic hawkers. These guys sold vials of holy water from Jerusalem, Rome, or this one puddle behind the abbey. Most were fake. Some were urine. Others were just local stream water with a dead bug floating inside. But people paid big money because medieval marketing worked. Put it in a fancy glass bottle, add a Latin inscription, throw in a free splinter of the true cross, and boom, salvation in a souvenir. Would it cure you? No. Would it make your corpse smell less sinful, maybe? Then came the plague years, and holy water took on an even darker tone. People ran to churches not just to pray, but to douse themselves in as much holy water as their shriveled, coughing bodies could handle. Some bathed in it, others drank it like wine. One desperate bishop ordered all wells in town to be re-blessed weekly. Guess how many people that saved spoiler rhymes with hero? Because no matter how sanctified, if you're drinking water that's seen more fingers than a public scroll, you're going to meet your maker quickly. And yet, no one stopped. They couldn't. Because medieval life was terrifying, short and wildly unpredictable. You needed something to believe in, something that looked like hope and smelled like mildew. Holy water was that thing. It was proof that something could wash away the fear, even if it couldn't wash away the actual cause of death. It was ritual. It was comfort. It was all they had. Fast forward to modern times, and holy water is now mostly ceremonial. It still exists, but nobody's drinking it like a health tonic. And if they are, maybe reconsider that friendship. Today fonts are occasionally cleaned. Some churches even use silver basins, which have mild antibacterial properties, because yes, even God has heard of hygiene now. But back then the concept of disinfecting sacred water was practically blasphemy. Why scrub what's already holy? Why purify what's pure? Why not just embrace the irony and let the water of salvation come with a side of plague? The absurdity isn't just funny, it's tragic. People were doing their best with what they had, and what they had was faith, filth, and fear. They believed in the sanctity of water even as it killed them. They touched it, kissed it, sipped it with reverence, and sometimes died hours later from infections it carried. Not because they were stupid, but because hope is blind, and in the Middle Ages hope came in liquid form. So next time you walk into a clean church, see a polished font and dip your finger in without a second thought smile. Because somewhere a 14th century peasant is watching from the great beyond whispering, "Enjoy it while it lasts, my fragrant child." We died for that splash. If you ever find yourself romanticising medieval villages, thinking of babbling brooks, mossy bridges and humble folk fetching pails of pure mountain water, stop. Just stop. The rivers of medieval Europe weren't nature's gift. They were Mother Nature's middle finger. These rivers didn't cleanse, they cursed. They didn't flow with life, they gurgled with doom. The average medieval river was a sewage canal with dreams of grandeur. It served every function under the sun: drinking water, laundry, toilet, fishery, corpse disposal site, industrial waste dump, and occasionally a venue for witch drownings. Picture that. One river, infinite purposes, and zero separation. Want to quench your thirst? Just dip your wooden cup right next to where old man Bernard just relieved himself. The flavour, earthy, with notes of regret. It wasn't even a secret. People knew rivers were gross. They saw the dead animals, the slime, the mysterious bubbles rising from dark corners like a satanic jacuzzi. But the thing is, they didn't have options. If your village had a river, you used it. It was like the medieval version of a toxic relationship. You knew it was ruining you, but you were too thirsty, tired, and constipated to leave. Sure, the river gave my uncle scabies, but it's our river. Let's visit London, shall we? A lovely place now. But in the Middle Ages it was home to the Thames, which doubled as a superhighway for feces, fish guts, and entire pigs floating belly up. Butchers dumped entrails into it. Tanners poured chemical waste. Latrines perched over it like demonic balconies. People still drank from it. Some even swam in it. Want to know how bad it got? There were royal decrees banning people from throwing dead bodies in the river. You know society's in trouble when you need official reminders not to drown grandma. And it wasn't just London. Every major European city had its own river of death. The Seine, in Paris. A perfume of urine and perfume runoff. The Tiber in Rome. Holy water meets holy hell. Even tiny village brooks got the same treatment. If water moved, it got used. If it didn't move, people still threw junk in it and wondered why frogs grew extra legs. Stagnant or flowing every stream was a bacterial roller coaster, and everyone had a season pass. Rivers weren't just dirty, they were weaponized. During sieges, invading armies would dump corpses and animal carcasses upstream to poison enemy towns downstream. It was medieval bio-warfare, no bullets, just bloated bodies and diarrhea. And the worst part, it worked. One dead cow rotting in a river could wipe out an entire village by Tuesday. Medieval warfare wasn't just brutal. It was brutally unsanitary. Still, people loved their rivers. They built mills on them, washed clothes in them, baptized babies in them. That's right. Baptisms. In the same water where 2 donkeys just mated, 3 fish floated sideways, and some guy threw up on his way home from the tavern. And no one thought to ask, should we maybe try a bucket? No. The river was sacred. The river was tradition. The river was literally trying to kill you. It didn't help that cities grew faster than their plumbing. By the 12th century, many towns had more people than latrines. So what did folks do? They used chamber pots and emptied them into the street, or directly into the river. Splash! Problem solved. Except the problem just floated downstream and reintroduced itself as your morning coffee. It was an endless cycle of dump, drink, repeat. A kind of brown-coloured karma. In dry seasons, things got even worse. Less water meant more concentration of filth. Rivers turned into sludge. Fish died. Smells intensified. Some people tried digging wells, but those often got contaminated too. Especially when they were next to graveyards, because apparently no one thought twice about putting your drinking hole next to Uncle Rupert's final resting place. If you didn't die from what was in the river, you died from what used to be next to it. Sometimes the river fought back. Floods were common, and when they came, they didn't bring just water. They brought everything: sewage, corpses, animal bones, forgotten boots, curses. Towns got washed in filth, and then wondered why everyone got pustules the next morning. Even after catastrophic flooding, there was no real clean-up. Just prayer and maybe a new saint to handle unholy moisture. They didn't rebuild the sanitation. They built shrines. Now we need to talk about fish. Yes, people still ate fish from these rivers, because what's better than a bottom feeder that spent its entire life swimming through decomposing peasants and pig entrails? Nothing whets the appetite like a medieval trout with glowing eyes and a mysterious cough. If you were lucky, the fish just tasted like mud. If you weren't, it came with a little extra something like worms or hallucinations. Either way, you ate it because protein is protein. Even the smell of rivers was legendary. Chroniclers described it as putrid godless and an assault on angels. One monk wrote that standing near the Thames in summer was akin to inhaling Satan's undergarments. City officials tried spreading herbs near rivers to mask the odour. Some floated flowers downstream like a watery apology. Others held religious processions to cleanse the river spiritually, which is medieval code for we're out of ideas. And yet people lived. They adapted. They learned not to drink directly, or to let the water rest, or to mix it with beer, or to just stop asking questions. Denial became the most effective filter. Because accepting how bad it was would mean admitting that everything you touched was trying to kill you. And that's too much to process when you still have to churn butter with a stick you found in the pig pen. Eventually, some towns tried solutions. Sewage channels, aqueducts, rules about dumping. But enforcement was spotty, and most people ignored the laws. Don't dump offal in the river became a suggestion like, don't marry your cousin, or don't burn the local witch unless you're absolutely sure. In theory, these laws made sense. In practice, they were scrolls of good intentions drowned in excrement. And what about the kids? Oh, the kids! They played near rivers, fell and drank from them, and occasionally floated away screaming. Drowning was one of the top causes of death among children, not because rivers were deep, but because medieval supervision was essentially he'll learn. Some towns built wooden rails. Others just accepted that if Timmy couldn't swim in plague soup, he wasn't meant for adulthood anyway. So let's review rivers were full of death, disease, industrial waste, human waste, animal waste, decomposing corpses, and the occasional holy relic someone accidentally flushed. They were sacred and feared, loved and loathed. They gave life and took it back immediately with interest. And still, people built their lives around them because they had to. There was no backup, no bottled option, no plan B. The river was everything, and everything included a surprising amount of human teeth. So next time you see a crystal clear river in a medieval painting, just know that artist was either a liar, an optimist, or painting from very far away. Because up close, the rivers of the Middle Ages weren't symbols of purity. They were graveyards with a current. Modern plumbing is one of those everyday miracles that you don't appreciate until it fails. A flush, a swirl, and your problems vanish literally. But back in the Middle Ages, the closest thing to plumbing was gravity and wishful thinking. If you wanted to relieve yourself, you didn't head to a cosy porcelain throne surrounded by lavender-scented candles. No, you took your chances with a wooden box hanging over a river moat or your neighbour's roof. It wasn't so much a bathroom as it was a dare. Let's start with the basics. Medieval toilets, if you could call them that, came in two flavours, the chamber pot variety and the long drop to doom edition. Chamber pots were just ceramic bowls you pooped in and then flung out the window like you were participating in some kind of sanitation-themed carnival. There were no sewage systems to carry waste away. Instead, the streets carried your business downhill, where it might mix with pig droppings, rainwater, and that one guy who always slept in the gutter. Urban planning more like urban surrender. But the real architectural marvels were the castle toilets. Known as guardrobes, these were small stone rooms built into the sides of castle walls, perched like medieval porta potties over open air. You sat on a plank with a hole in it, and whatever came out of you dropped straight down into a pit or moat, or if you were unlucky onto the heads of peasants passing below. Privacy wasn't a big thing, drafts constant, and falling in surprisingly common. Yes, people actually fell into their own toilets. Death by poop was not a metaphor, it was a Tuesday. These toilet shafts were narrow, steep, and very, very vertical. No railings, no safety nets, just gravity, stone, and faith. Some garderobes had 2 seats because nothing says medieval bonding like pooping beside your cousin while discussing turnip yields. And the smell! Let's just say if your ancestors had sinuses that survived this setup, you probably owe them your immune system. There were no air fresheners, just the natural perfume of centuries-old human despair wafting upward like a haunting. Now, if you were a commoner, things were much worse. No garderobes, no moats, just a communal latrine if you were lucky, or the good old go in a bucket and toss it technique. Night soil collectors. Yes, that's a real job title, walk the streets before dawn collecting poop from barrels, pits and street corners. They were the unsung heroes of the medieval world, though no one wanted to stand downwind of them. Ironically, they made good money because even in the 1300s, waste management was recession-proof. In some cities there were public toilets. These were long benches with holes carved into them, sometimes placed over running water, which was supposed to carry the waste away. That's the theory. In practice, the waste often got stuck rotted in place or came back upstream like an uninvited guest. Imagine sitting there pants down next to a stranger when a surprise bubble of sewer ghost floats up and whispers to your backside. Sanctified trauma. That's what that is. And yet people adapted. Some carried their own cloth to wipe with, others used hay moss, or if desperate, a smooth rock and a scream. Toilet paper. That would take several hundred more years and at least one industrial revolution. Royals sometimes used bits of wool or linen which they discarded like napkins after a messy feast. The poor used what nature offered, which explains why medieval forests were less enchanted woodlands and more wiping galleries. But let's not forget the disasters. Toilets collapsed, wooden seats rotted through. One record from 1184 tells of a German nobleman who was holding a council meeting when the floor beneath the latrine gave way, sending him and over 60 others into the cesspit below. They all drowned in poop. That's not just a bad day, that's a medieval punchline from hell. And still, castles continued to build guardrobes the same way, because tradition matters, even if it kills you. Some castles tried to innovate. They built murder holes directly beneath the toilet shafts, so if invaders climbed up from below, they got a literal face full of surprise. Nothing says defensive strategy like weaponized excrement. Others added chutes made of stone, hoping it would redirect the waste away from living quarters. Did it work? Sort of, until the chutes clogged. Then you had medieval plumbing's final boss, the backflow. There is no coming back from that. Then there was the psychological horror, the darkness of the shafts, the occasional rat, the fact that some garderobes were located outside the main castle walls, meaning you had to brave the cold rain and potential bandits just to take a dump, which meant many people held it in as long as possible, creating entire generations of medieval constipation. You think IBS is modern think again. It was just called Tuesday stomach back then. And of course there was no washing your hands. Ever. Soap was rare. Running water, a fantasy. Most people just wiped their hands on their tunic or didn't wipe at all, which means that handshake from your local lord probably came with extra seasoning. And then he went and blessed your baby with those same hands. Surprise your child's now protected by 3 types of divine grace and 4 types of gastrointestinal bacteria. What about smells, you ask? Well, some clever lords designed garderobes so that the wind carried the stench away. Others lined the shafts with herbs or had baskets of flowers nearby to distract guests from the reality of what they were stepping into. But most people just got used to it. If you've been marinating in filth since birth, your nose eventually gives up. Smell fatigue is real. After a while, everything just smells like life. Medieval life. In cities, some buildings had overhang toilets, wooden boxes that stuck out over alleyways. Residents would sit in these boxes and do their business directly onto the street below. Good luck if you were walking by. The common phrase "garder l'eau French" for watch out for the water was shouted just before dumping the contents of a chamber pot out the window. If you were too slow, you earned an impromptu baptism. Urban life was a full contact sport. Plumbing in monasteries was slightly more advanced. Some had rudimentary flushing systems, gravity-powered water channels that moved waste away from the latrines. Monks, despite being celibate, knew how to engineer a good poop chute. But even then things broke, clogged and overflowed. Holy men found themselves elbow-deep in filth, muttering Latin prayers that definitely translated to "Why me lord monastic silence" was often just trauma suppression. Ironically, most people believed disease came from bad air or miasmas, not from the literal mountains of excrement they lived on top of. So while they built toilets that dropped straight into public waterways, they also carried pomanders, little scented balls to ward off invisible evil smells. It was like lighting a scented candle in a burning landfill. Cute, but useless. Yet through all this, no one invented a better system. Not really. Toilets stayed dangerous, unsanitary, haunted, and people just lived with it. Because death by toilet was a fact of life. You hadn't really made it until you pooped in a freezing stone tower and prayed not to fall into the abyss. Honestly, the medieval toilet experience built character, or at least gastrointestinal resilience. So the next time you complain about a clogged drain, a weak flush, or a public restroom that smells a little off, just remember at least your toilet isn't suspended over a moat, being shared with the ghost of your uncle, guarded by rats, and structurally held together by mould. You live in a golden age. Respect the porcelain, and when you flush, maybe whisper a little thank you to the ghosts of those who didn't make it out of the garderobe alive. You'd think that if half of Europe was dying, people would start connecting the dots. Dead bodies, dirty rivers, fleas throwing raves in your underwear. But nope, medieval logic didn't work like that. When the Black Death arrived, people didn't ask, "Hey, could this be? Because we live ankle-deep in fermented excrement and drink out of plague-flavoured puddles." Instead, they blamed Jews, astrology, bad smells, sin the alignment of Saturn, and of course, witches. Everything except the bubbling, fetid disease soup they called drinking water. Let's paint a lovely mental image. It's 1347 and the ships roll into port. Some sailors are already dead. Others are barely clinging to life, their bodies covered in giant black boils, oozing death juice. Most people would run. But the curious medieval crowd gathered on the docks like it was a farmer's market. They helped unload cargo. They shook hands. They shared wine. Within weeks, entire cities started coughing and bleeding and turning purple, and the rivers, they became plague slip and slides. The bacteria Yersinia pestis was the mastermind behind the Black Death hitching rides on fleas, which rode on rats, which rode on boats which ended up in towns where people dumped their waste into rivers and drank it the next day. It was the perfect storm of ignorance, filth, and overconfidence. Water didn't just help spread the plague, it gave it a 5-star highway system. Fleas drowned, rats floated, and people still dipped their jugs in the same spot where a bloated cat corpse bobbed like a medieval tea bag. By the time anyone realised something was horribly wrong, it was far too late. Cities like Florence, London and Paris saw up to 60% of their populations vanish. And still, no one said, maybe stop washing wounds in sewage water. Instead, they threw flowers in the air to clean the air, burned incense, and kept drinking their disease cocktails, because the local priest said water was God's gift. Apparently, God was feeling spicy that year, and if you got sick, good luck. The treatment for plague was bathing in vinegar and rose water, because what better way to cleanse your rotting flesh than with diluted perfume? Some doctors prescribed bleeding the patient, or boiling onions, or sitting in a hot bath next to a goat. If none of that worked, and spoiler it didn't, your best bet was to chug holy water and hope for the best. Of course, by then your organs were already writing their resignation letters. What role did water actually play in spreading the Black Death? A big one. Not only did rivers and wells act as communal plague buffets, but laundry water, bath water, and even soup water all became infected. Remember, people didn't boil water. They barely boiled food. They reused wash basins for everything: bathing, cooking, soaking wounds, and occasionally baptizing babies. So if one person had the plague, the whole family got it, plus the neighbour, plus the cow, plus the guy down the road who just wanted a sip. The plague had a better distribution network than Amazon, and don't even get started on wells. They seemed like a safe alternative, but when your latrine is 15 feet from your well, and both are downhill from the pig pen, you're not drinking spring water. You're drinking a medieval smoothie. Wells weren't sealed. Animals fell in. People occasionally fell in, and if someone died in there, they stayed in there. Because hauling out a decomposing body was someone else's problem, and if the corpse was already blessed, even better. Miracle water, Some towns got clever and passed ordinances about dumping waste into water. Penalties were imposed, fines were threatened. Guess how effective that was? Exactly 0%. People ignored the laws because survival was day to day. Don't throw waste in the river sounds good until you're holding a full chamber pot and the river is right there calling your name like a sewage siren. Law or no law, gravity always wins. Doctors, those brave-beaked mask-wearing optimists, had no idea what they were doing. Their theories range from bad humours to poisoned air to spiritual imbalance. Not one said, maybe don't bathe your infected boils in community bathwater. And so every effort to heal people just made things worse. The sick were gathered in plague houses which often had shared water sources. One infected man coughed near a water barrel, and voila now the whole neighbourhood's dying. It was like medieval Oprah. You get the plague and you get the plague. Even the dead didn't get a break. Corpses were dumped in mass graves often after being rinsed or half-washed in communal water to prepare them for burial. Imagine that. A half-rotted body being given a sponge bath with the same water your kid drinks from. Sanitary. Non-symbolic. Also no, just deeply, deeply cursed. Some priests tried to bless the water before use, but unless holy salt can kill Yersinia pestis, it was basically just seasoning the problem. Let's pause and talk about plague pits. These were mass graves where bodies were stacked like cordwood often, right next to a river because it was convenient. When it rained, these pits flooded. Guess where the contaminated water went? That's right into well streams and your soup pot. One storm could infect an entire town, and when the floods came, everything ran together, waste blood, runoff plague juices, and probably someone's forgotten lunch. Nature became the ultimate blender. In rural areas, things weren't much better. People still relied on streams and rainwater, but animals drank from the same spots and no one filtered anything. In fact, if the water looked too clear, people got suspicious. It doesn't have enough flavour, they'd say. Flavour being code for disease particles. Clean water was untrustworthy. Dirty water had character. By 1351, the worst of the Black Death had burned through Europe like a divine punishment with boundary issues. Tens of millions dead. Whole villages wiped off the map. And yet nothing about water usage changed. People still shared fonts, still washed clothes and corpses in the same buckets, still believed that evil smells, not actual bacteria, were to blame. Because why fix a system when you can die in it? To make matters worse, survivors often believed that they were protected by divine favour or superior bloodlines. They didn't think their hygiene or lack thereof saved them. They thought God liked them better, which meant they kept doing all the same things that spread disease in the first place, drinking out of dead rivers, washing in stew water, letting the cat sleep in the water basin. The plague was gone for now, but the soup was still simmering. Some cities eventually tried rudimentary sanitation. London and Paris made attempts to regulate where people dumped waste. Some towns experimented with separating drinking water from sewage, but it took centuries and more plagues for these ideas to become standard. The truth was too ugly. No one wanted to admit that water, the thing that gave life, was also the executioner. So they kept drinking, praying, coughing, and dying. Rinse and repeat. So the next time you sip water from a clean glass and don't immediately feel a cold sweat of impending doom, just remember you're living in luxury. Medieval people would have traded 3 cows and a blessed bone just to not poop blood after breakfast. Your water has no rats in it, no corpse residue, no open-air toilets draining into it. It's not a disease soup, it's a miracle. Treat it accordingly. Maybe with a toast, to clean water and the poor plague-soaked fools who never had it. Ah, the luxury of a hot bath. Bubbles, steam, maybe a rubber duck if you're emotionally stable, But in the Middle Ages, a hot bath wasn't comfort, it was a death sentence. Heating water that was asking for your pores to open, your humours to rebel, and your soul to slip out through your kneecaps. Medieval people didn't fear heat because they were delicate, they feared it because they genuinely believed it boiled your life force. Let's start with the science. Oh, wait, there wasn't any. Medieval science was mostly a mix of Greek philosophy, astrology, and desperate guesses made by men in robes with wine breath. The theory of the four humours ruled all blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. These bodily fluids needed to be in balance, or you'd fall into a horrifying state known as unwell. Too much heat. That meant your blood boiled, your bile bubbled, and your entire soul turned into soup, steam, evil. So when someone suggested a hot bath, it wasn't met with, "That sounds relaxing." It was met with, "Do you have a death wish?" People believed warm water opened the pores, and when the pores were open, bad things got in. Bad air, evil spirits, sin, plague, probably a demon or two. You weren't washing dirt off. You were inviting Satan into your bloodstream. That steam cloud, not ambiance. That was a portal to hell. And God forbid you had a fever, because then you were already too hot. Adding bath water to that equation was like throwing a pig into a bonfire and hoping it walks out cured. Physicians warned against bathing the sick in anything warmer than sadness. Cold compresses acceptable. Lukewarm water risky. A hot bath. Better start carving the headstone. Many genuinely believe that warmth could boil the soul, which, fun fact, has never been medically proven. Of course, there were exceptions, usually among the rich, who had the money and madness to heat water and still bathe like semi-decent humans. Royal bathhouses existed. Some were even opulent, with private rooms, scented herbs, and servants fanning steam in like it was spiritual fog. But even there, hot water was viewed as indulgent, not practical. You didn't bathe hot to get clean. You bathed hot to feel naughty. It was like medieval ASMR with a side of skin rash. Peasants, meanwhile, didn't even have to worry about the hot-cold debate. They barely had water, let alone firewood, to waste on heating it. Most bathed on rare occasions in cold rivers, muddy streams, or in wooden tubs filled with whatever temperature the rain had decided to be. If they boiled water, it was for food, not hygiene. Bathing in hot water was considered as ridiculous as feeding soup to your shoes. Just unnecessary, extravagant, and probably fatal. Even monasteries, centres of supposed wisdom, cautioned against heat. Monks were often forbidden to bathe more than a few times a year. Hot water was seen as sensual, and if there's one thing monks hated more than Satan, it was feeling good. The rule of St. Benedict didn't specify water temperature, but plenty of monastic texts suggested that warm baths stirred the loins. So to protect their vows and their reputations, they stuck with cold water, occasional scrubbing, and a deep, unspoken hatred for spa days. Let's also not forget the terrifying association between heat and madness. Some believed that too much heat, whether from the sun, a fever, or a hot bath, could literally cook your brain. This was supported by people pointing at sweaty villagers and saying, "See, he looks insane." If someone acted erratically, they were said to have been in the heat too long. Not a metaphor. A real diagnostic statement. Too hot. Jan too unhinged. The cure cold compresses and spiritual counselling. And maybe a leech. Speaking of leeches, medical practitioners did try combining bathing with healing. Steam baths were sometimes used to sweat out demons or release toxins, which honestly just meant giving someone heat stroke in a wooden closet. They'd stuff you in a steam hut, chant a few blessings, and hope your boils exploded in a spiritually fulfilling way. You'd come out half-conscious, drenched, and somehow still considered rebalanced. Because if you're nearly dead, you're probably cured. That's medieval math. Of course, heat wasn't always feared. In small doses it was medicinal. You might warm your feet, heat a poultice, or toast a compress over a fire. But the moment water touched your whole body, that was the danger zone. A full-body hot soak was like sticking your essence in a cauldron. You didn't just risk getting sick, you risked melting your morality. Hot water wasn't just physical, it was philosophical. It said I feel good, and nothing terrified the medieval world more than people feeling good. And don't forget childbirth. If a woman wanted a warm bath during labour, she had to fight the midwife, the priest, and the neighbour, screaming about steam spirits. Cold water was preferred, which probably didn't help the whole trauma thing. And if the baby was stillborn, people blamed the water. Not the unsanitary conditions, not the inbreeding, not the complete absence of prenatal care, just the bath temperature. Because why be rational when you can blame steam? The cultural fear went beyond medicine. In art and literature, steam was rarely depicted as wholesome. It signalled seduction, temptation, or death. Witches were shown brewing in steamy cauldrons. Demons emerged from sulphurous mists. If you saw a character in a bath, you knew something scandalous or fatal was about to happen. Even Dante's Inferno had hot, steamy pits for the lustful and the wrathful. Hell wasn't icy. Hell was a hot tub for sinners. Ironically, modern science tells us heat does open pores, but not to demons. It can help cleanse the skin, soothe muscles, and reduce infection risk when used properly. But medieval folks didn't have microscopes. They had leeches and fear. And so hot water remained a suspicious luxury, something used rarely, hesitantly, and with at least one eye open for the devil. Because if it felt nice, it was probably a trap. Over time, the bath as death idea began to fade. Renaissance thinkers, influenced by the rediscovery of Roman bathing culture, began experimenting with heated baths again. But even then, superstition lingered. Don't bathe during a full moon. Don't heat water after sunset. Don't let your bath touch your shadow. It took hundreds of years and several pandemics before people fully accepted that heat wasn't the enemy. Just the filth was. So next time you're soaking in a warm bath surrounded by bubbles and serenity, remember somewhere in the 14th century a monk is looking down from heaven, clutching his rosary and whispering, "You're boiling your soul." Meanwhile, a peasant ghost peers in through your bathroom mirror and mutters, "Luxury scum." Then again, that's what happens when you live in a world where comfort is heresy and steam is sorcery. Enjoy the bath. If you think medieval peasants were dirty, wait until you meet the professionals monks. You know, the solemn, robe-wearing, vow-taking spiritual squad who spent their days chanting in Latin and their nights marinating. While the outside world avoided bathing out of fear, monks took it a step further. They avoided it out of principle. Because why just smell bad when you can smell holy? Bathing to medieval monks wasn't hygiene. It was hedonism with bubbles. Many believed that washing too often invited vanity, encouraged lust, or even disrespected God. After all, if Jesus walked the earth in sandals without stopping to exfoliate, who were they to reach for soap? Cleanliness might have been next to godliness, but filth was closer to humility. And if there's one thing monks loved more than Gregorian chants, it was humiliation. So how often did they bathe brace yourself? Some orders allowed a full-body bath once a month, others once a year, and a few, especially the extra pious ones, only bathed if they fell into a river or were about to die. And even then they'd probably apologize for the luxury. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. I accidentally washed my elbows." It wasn't just about staying holy. It was about proving you were tough enough to stare down fungus and say, "Not today, Satan. I smell like salvation." And yet monasteries weren't complete cesspits. Many had elaborate cloistered plumbing systems, some even more advanced than nearby towns. They built aqueducts, drained latrines away from living quarters, and occasionally heated water. But it wasn't for fun, it was for rituals, or maybe an emergency, or when Brother Bartholomew's armpit started attracting wildlife. Baths weren't indulgent. They were a crisis response. There were rules. So many rules. The rule of St. Benedict, basically, the medieval monk's employee manual, didn't say don't bathe, but it didn't exactly encourage it either. It focused more on prayer, work and silence, which meant if you did bathe, you had to do it quietly, quickly, and with a soul-crushing sense of guilt. Monks weren't allowed to talk during meals, so imagine how talkative bath time was. Spoiler, it wasn't. Just the sound of sloshing scrubbing and the occasional whispered apology to St. Jerome. Some monks even shared water. That's right. Communal tubs, one bucket, multiple bodies, no soap, no shame. You'd wash as much as the water would allow, which after 5 or 6 brothers wasn't much more than a moist encouragement. By the time the abbot stepped in, the tub looked less like holy water and more like a broth of repentance. But no one complained. Complaining was prideful. And pride, as we all know, smells like citrus body wash. Of course, monks had other methods of cleaning, like scraping. They used scrapers, metal or wooden tools to scrape off dirt and dead skin. This was seen as less indulgent than bathing, more rugged, more spiritual. Nothing like carving off a layer of yourself to feel closer to Christ. And if that didn't work, you could try dry washing, rubbing your skin with a cloth or sand to stimulate the flesh. It didn't remove much, but it did let you say I tried and still smell like a cheese seller. And what about the clothes? Those voluminous brown or black robes, not exactly moisture wicking. They were rarely washed, maybe once a season, maybe. And they were worn over linen undergarments which were supposed to absorb sweat and filth. These too were washed irregularly depending on how many lice had declared war on your pelvis. But again, that was part of the path. To smell bad was to exist beyond the body. To walk among men while smelling like the ark's back end, that was monkhood, baby. You'd think the vow of poverty would mean fewer clothes and more washing. But no. It meant wear what you have until it walks off on its own. Shoes were often worn until they fell apart and robes were patched so many times they resembled medieval quilts of suffering. And still monks believed that this visible, smellable sacrifice brought them closer to enlightenment. You can meditate on the nature of impermanence, or you can live it through mildew. Ironically, despite the filth, monks were often in charge of hospitals and healing. That's right, the unwashed were your local healthcare providers. Need a wound stitched, a tooth yanked, a prayer for your boil. Brother Stenchington would gladly help, just ignore the fungal forest blooming from his sandal strap. And don't expect him to wash his hands. He's purified by faith, not by water. Now hold still while he blesses the abscess. There were exceptions, of course. Some monastic orders, especially in warmer climates, bathed more frequently, partly because rot spreads faster when the sun's involved. A few even embraced ancient Roman bath designs with warm rooms and cold plunges. But even then they kept things severely boring. No talking, no laughing, no splashing. If you got too comfortable, the abbot might scowl at you from behind a steam cloud and mutter something about damnation. Because nothing ruins a good soak like eternal fire. And let's not forget the scented saints. Some saints, when exhumed, were said to smell sweet. This odour of sanctity was seen as divine proof of their purity. But secretly people were just amazed they didn't smell like death wrapped in burlap. It was a miracle. Or maybe they were just one of the few who had bathed before burial. Either way, it left an impression cleanliness might be godly after death, but during life, better to reek of piety. Even after death, monks weren't given spa treatment. Bodies were wrapped, maybe splashed with a bit of wine or vinegar and buried. No embalming, no scrubbing. If you'd only bathed once a year in life, why start now? The afterlife would cleanse you, or so they hoped. Meanwhile, the living buried their noses in their sleeves and tried not to breathe too deeply at funerals. So why did they keep doing this? Why choose a life of deliberate stench because suffering equaled sanctity? To be uncomfortable was to be pure. To stink was to prove you were above earthly concerns. And to bathe was to risk vanity temptation and possibly enjoy yourself, 3 things strictly forbidden in most monastic contracts. Water didn't wash away sin, suffering did. Bonus points if you were crusty while doing it. But here's the wild twist: these same monks copied and preserved medical texts that talked about cleanliness. Ancient Greek and Roman sources often advocated regular bathing. Hippocrates' Galen, they all believed in it. The monks wrote those texts by candlelight, carefully, lovingly, and then said, "Nice theory. Let's never do it." It was the ultimate medieval paradox: preserve knowledge but don't apply it. A tradition still alive in some modern universities. So the next time you light a candle, pour a hot bath and soak with music and essential oils, just picture a 13th century monk standing in your doorway. He's clutching his robe, eyes wide with horror, whispering, "What have you done?" And you smile, lean back and whisper, "Something you never did, Brother Bartholomew. Something glorious. I cleaned." Rain. Sweet romantic rain. The stuff of poetry, slow kisses and overpriced scented candles. But if you lived in the Middle Ages, rain was not romance. Rain was sudden, airborne disease juice sent directly from the sky. Each drop was a potential hex, a cold, wet missile of pestilence that could soak your tunic and sentence you to 3 weeks of coughing up phlegm shaped like saints. Rain wasn't weather. It was warfare. In the modern world, we welcome rain, we splash in it, dance in it, build TikToks around it. Medieval people. They ran from it like it owed them money, because in their worldview, getting wet meant opening your pores. And what happens when your pores are open? Evil gets in. Spirits. Bad humours. Sin. Maybe a flea or 2 wearing a tiny plague hat. Getting caught in the rain wasn't inconvenient, it was a one-way ticket to the monastery's death wing. And umbrellas. Oh, they existed, sort of. But not for the peasants, certainly not for the monks. Umbrellas were weird, foreign, exotic contraptions mostly seen in ancient Egypt, China, or depictions of Roman emperors. In medieval Europe, the average person's umbrella was a prayer and a piece of soggy cloth. You got creative: drape your cloak over your head, hide under a cart, or just yell at the clouds. One popular tactic was ducking under your neighbour's livestock. Not great, but it was either that or smell like wet wool and regret. We have records, honest-to-God records, of people refusing to attend religious festivals if it was raining. Not because they were lazy, because they believed God was testing them, and if they got wet, that meant they'd fail the test. Some even saw rain as divine punishment. So instead of umbrellas, they carried rosaries. You weren't keeping water off, you were praying it didn't kill you. Medieval weatherproofing, blind hope, and a bucket on your head. And what about outerwear? Did they have cloaks? Yes, of course. Thick, scratchy, poorly treated wool cloaks that absorbed water like sin absorbs guilt. Once wet, they stayed wet for days. There was no Gore-Tex, no water-repellent coating, just layers of despair woven into a soggy burrito of fabric. Walking home from the fields during a storm felt less like transportation and more like drowning on land. Shoes were worse, leather sometimes, often just scraps of hide or wooden soles tied with string. Rain turned roads into rivers of mud feces and sharp mystery. Your shoes filled with water, then they rubbed, then they gave you blisters, then those blisters got infected. And just like that, a light drizzle turned into an amputated foot. The sky didn't need to hurl thunderbolts, it had humidity. And let's not forget the roofs. Thatched roofs were common, made of straw or reeds, and they leaked like medieval secrets. A sudden storm could soak your entire household. Beds wet, bread wet, goat. Somehow even wetter. Rain didn't stop at your skin, it followed you inside, found your warmest blanket and ruined it. Wealthier homes had slate or tile roofs which were slightly better, but rain had its ways. Cracks, chimneys. That one hole no one bothered to fix because Brother Arnold swore it was ventilation. People even wrote about rain in apocalyptic terms. Chronicles would say things like the heavens wept bitterly upon the land, or God's sorrow poured upon the unworthy. Translation. It rained on Tuesday. But that level of drama made sense, because sometimes it didn't just rain, it flooded. Fields drowned, crops died, rats danced, rivers overflowed and brought weeks-old sewage right into your cabbage garden. Rain wasn't just uncomfortable, it was economically traumatic. And if you think people at least appreciated how rain watered the earth, think again. Many believed that rain was fine in theory, as long as it never actually touched them. Let it fall, they'd say, but somewhere else. There are entire prayers begging for gentle rain, distant rain, or rain that only touches the sinful village 3 miles away. Medieval meteorology was just hoping your neighbour got the storm instead. Some towns built covered walkways, a kind of early arcade, so that people could walk during light rain without getting soaked. But these were rare. Mostly when the sky turned dark, everyone just stopped what they were doing and ran for cover like it was the plague, and sometimes it was. Thunder made people drop to their knees. Lightning was practically witchcraft. Rain was the opening act for divine smiting. No one carried a picnic basket. They carried regrets. Even in art, rain was suspect. Very few medieval paintings show people happily existing in the rain. Usually they're hiding from it, or suffering because of it, or being punished by it. Rain was symbolic of judgment. If it rained on your wedding day, you didn't say, "How romantic." You said, well, one of us will probably die in childbirth. Romantic. Let's take a moment to revisit the umbrella. The concept did exist in Europe eventually. The earliest versions looked more like parasol shields used by royalty to block the sun, not the rain. They were symbols of status, not utility. If someone had one, it meant they were rich enough not to walk anywhere. Why? Because holding a stick with the silk flap over your head didn't help when the sky was vomiting ice water onto your face. It wasn't until centuries later that umbrellas became common. Until then, rain protection was a cloak and divine indifference. And of course, there were the healers who had their own take on rain. Some said getting caught in the rain could cool the liver, leading to melancholy and bad dreams. Others swore that rain on the neck caused seizures. One 14th century remedy for rain fever involved wrapping your feet in warm cow dung and humming a hymn to St. Apollonia. I wish I were kidding, but hey, at least it distracted you from the pneumonia. Rain also messed with food storage. Granaries leaked, bread moulded, salt turned to mush. People starved. Then they got sick from drinking stagnant water. Then they blamed the rain for souring the blood. Everything the rain touched either rotted or infected you, except priests who insisted that rain was cleansing. Yeah, cleansing like a bleach bath full of eels. One more medieval gem people feared that rain could make you smell worse. That's right. If you were already fermenting under 4 layers of unwashed linen, getting wet made it worse. The smell intensified. Clothes clung tighter. Skin chafed. And once you dried out, if you dried out, you were left with mildew patches, skin rashes, and that lingering scent of despair stew. A good rainstorm could ruin your week and your reputation, yet somehow rain kept falling, and people kept surviving. Barely. The rain would stop, the clouds would part, and everyone would pretend it hadn't just tried to murder them. They'd go back to their chores, their prayers, their lice-picking, until the next time the sky growled. Then it was back under the cow or under the wagon or behind the stone wall, where old Maud once claimed she heard Satan whisper during a thunderstorm. Don't question it, just keep dry. So the next time you complain about forgetting your umbrella, remember you're not hiding from sin-soaked droplets that promise fever, fungal infection, and economic collapse. You're just avoiding a mild inconvenience. Raise your umbrella with pride. You're the descendant of people who ran from the rain like it was wearing a knife. And they were kind of right. It's hard to imagine a world where the act of getting clean could lead to eternal damnation. But welcome to the Middle Ages, where bathing wasn't just risky, it was morally questionable. That's right, you weren't just washing off dirt, you were washing off virtue. The church wasn't mad you smelled like a damp goat, it was mad you enjoyed not smelling like one. Because if it felt good, it was probably from the devil. Let's rewind. The early Christian church, in all its robe-wearing glory, inherited some of its distaste for bathing from the Romans. The Romans had public bath-scented oils, marble floors, naked statues, actual naked people, and a casual attitude towards sin. So naturally, early Christians took one look at all that and said absolutely not. That leads directly to orgies, which in fairness it sometimes did. But instead of reforming it, they just burned the concept to the ground. By the time the medieval era rolled around, bathing had been downgraded from routine hygiene to spiritual peril, with a side of nudity. Church leaders, monks, and self-proclaimed pious types began preaching that the body was not to be pampered. Pleasure, even mild, clean-smelling pleasure, was suspect. If you slipped into a warm bath and thought, this feels nice, you had already failed the test. Better to suffer in filth than slip into temptation in soapy water. And don't even think about mixed-gender bathing. It was common in Roman times. It even lingered into the early Middle Ages in bathhouses across Europe. But by the 13th century, those shared tubs of semi-naked strangers were labelled dens of sin. People still went, of course, and they still did things. But the church wasn't pleased. Priests began warning that a bathhouse was where you could lose your soul, along with your pants and your family's honour. This belief crept into laws, sermons, and daily life. In some towns, bathhouses were shuttered entirely on Sundays and holy days because nothing says blasphemy like rinsing your feet while others are fasting. Women who frequented bathhouses were whispered about. Loose, frivolous, possibly in league with Satan. And if you were a widow who took too many baths, you were probably also a witch, or at least thinking about becoming one. Scrubbing your elbows was a slippery slope. Of course the church made exceptions. Rich people, for instance. If you were a noble and wanted to bathe, no one stopped you. You just had to do it with enough piety. Add a crucifix, maybe chant a psalm while lathering, and definitely make sure no one saw you smiling. 'Cause God is always watching and apparently judging your use of lavender oil. Ironically, monasteries, those havens of piety and unwashed linen, sometimes had excellent bathing facilities. Cloisters with running water, heated baths, tiled floors. But were they used for comfort? Absolutely not. They were used with grim necessity, like a man preparing for execution. If Brother Matthew stepped into warm water and let out a relaxed sigh, someone might report him. He enjoyed it, Abbot. He closed his eyes for a second. We need an exorcism. Bathing became ritualized suffering, done quietly, rarely, and with the mental fortitude of a soldier preparing for war. Some texts even advised taking cold baths specifically because they were unpleasant. The pain was good for the soul. Pleasure was a weakness. Soap was suspicious, bubbles heretical. Let's not forget the symbolism. Water was associated with baptism's spiritual cleansing. But if you started applying that logic to your armpits, people got nervous. Yes, clean your soul, but not too much of your body. The message was clear: bathe once to be reborn, and after that, stay crusty. If God wanted you fragrant, he'd have filled your pores with frankincense. Even literature got in on the act. Heroes were rarely described as clean. Warriors were gritty, bloody weathered. Saints covered in hair shirts, ashes, and a general aura of fungal humility. No one ever said she entered the cathedral radiant and freshly bathed, because that woman would have been stoned, or at least passive-aggressively sermonized. And for women, bathing was a minefield. A clean woman was suspicious. She was either seducing someone plotting something or had unholy self-esteem. Medieval beauty manuals occasionally recommended cleansing with milk, honey, or vinegar. But those were usually for noble women, and bridespeople who had one specific job: look good for a man, then retreat into sanctified stink for the rest of your life. If a peasant girl showed up too clean, someone would accuse her of trying to ensnare the baker's apprentice with shampoo. This fear of bathing went beyond logic. It became deep psychological conditioning. Children were raised to fear indulgence. A warm bath became a moral test. Can you cleanse your body without loving it? Can you scrub your toes and still feel like a martyr? If you start humming in the tub, does that mean Satan has entered the room? These were real concerns. People whispered them, priests muttered them, and most folks just chose the safer path: stay dirty and stay saved. But here's the delicious irony: despite the fear, people still wanted to bathe. The bathhouses never truly died. They just went underground. Literally and figuratively. Hidden rooms, private tubs, secret visits under cover of darkness. Some had coded symbols on their doors. A clean towel meant safe to enter. A rosemary sprig meant don't ask questions. People would risk their reputations, their confessions, and their eternal souls for 10 minutes of warm water and basic dignity. Doctors, too, slowly began to rebel. A few daring physicians, especially those influenced by Arabic and Greek texts, argued that bathing could prevent illness, that cleanliness was not vanity, but necessity. Naturally, they were called heretics, and sometimes French. But over time, cracks formed in the filth-first theology. A few towns began allowing public baths again, quietly, carefully, with limits, and always with a healthy side of shame. The Renaissance would eventually begin to shift these attitudes, slowly, painfully. But in the heart of the medieval world, the message stood firm: if you bathe, and like it, you're flirting with hell. Clean bodies led to unclean thoughts. Unclean thoughts led to sin. Sin led to fire. So better to embrace grime and live longer in theory, or at least die knowing your soul wasn't lost in a bubble bath. So next time you step into a shower, take a moment to thank every secret bather, every rebellious monk, every woman who scrubbed her feet in defiance of doctrine. You're here clean and joyful because someone once whispered to hell with it and poured hot water on their own sinful flesh, and probably got excommunicated. If you think your gym locker room smells bad, congratulations, you'd still be the king of fragrance in medieval Europe. Because somewhere between the fall of the Roman baths and the rise of the Renaissance, the Western world entered a golden age of odour, a time when scent wasn't just ignored, it was actively feared, forbidden, or baptised with vinegar. Historians call it the late Middle Ages, but let's be honest, it was the stink era. The stink era wasn't a phase, it was a full-blown lifestyle, a centuries-long olfactory apocalypse, a time when people bragged about not bathing. Dirt became virtue, stench became status, and the mere desire to smell nice could get you labelled as vain, suspicious, or even French. Welcome to a world where soap was suspect, perfume was witchcraft, and the only thing stronger than the body odour was the moral superiority behind it. The turning point, easy, the Black Death. After waves of plague wiped out half of Europe, people began associating water with disease, bathing with death, and cleanliness with vulnerability. Bodies were burned, water was avoided. Priests warned that open pores could let in miasmas, invisible clouds of death air. And nothing open pores quite like a nice warm bath, so everyone stopped bathing. And then they stopped talking about it, and then they decided it was holy. It was like a continent-wide nose blindness took hold. People layered on linen, wool and leather and sweated through every stitch for days, weeks, sometimes months. Instead of washing, they added more fabric. Want to get cleaner? Wear a second tunic. Want to smell better? Tie a dried orange peel to your belt and hope for the best. If you were really lucky, you'd have a tiny cloth sachet called a pomander, filled with cloves or herbs, basically a medieval air freshener dangling from your waist like a desperate apology to anyone within breathing distance. The upper classes leaned in. They weren't just stinky, they were expensively stinky. Kings wore scented gloves to mask their funk. Queens stuffed flowers into their sleeves. Nobles sprinkled rose water on their undergarments and called it hygiene. There's even a report of a French duke who bathed only twice a year, once for Easter and once before Christmas, like a dirty little religious ritual. Everyone else just followed suit. Why question royalty when they reek so regally? The poor. They did what they could, which was mostly suffer. There was no soap, no time, no servants to carry in hot water or scrub their backs with rosemary twigs. Peasants bathed in rivers maybe twice a year if the pigs hadn't claimed it first. They dried off with the same cloth they used to clean their tools. Then they went back to ploughing the fields in pants that hadn't been washed since their grandfather's baptism. If they smelled, no one noticed, because everyone smelled. And don't think for a second that medical professionals helped. Physicians, bless their plague-masked hearts, doubled down. Sweating is good, they said. Dirt protects you from disease. A famous 15th century doctor even wrote that water weakens the heart. Not arsenic, not open wounds, not rats, no water. That refreshing, hydrating, life-sustaining substance too risky. Just eat garlic and rub your armpits with ashes. That'll clear up the Black Death. The most horrifying part. People didn't just accept the stink, they started to fetishize it. Natural musk became a sign of virility. A strong smell meant you were strong-willed. Women were encouraged to tolerate their husband's scent as a sign of devotion. One chronicler even wrote, "A man's true character can be judged by the richness of his odour. Translation: the more you reek, the more you rule." It was deodorant Darwinism. Clothes were never washed, they were aired out, hung in the breeze and then put right back on. Underwear optional. Bathing children. Only if they were visibly crusting, and if someone dared to complain, the answer was always the same: God made dirt and dirt don't hurt. That or something about St. Jerome and humility. Either way, you were expected to live in your own funk like it was armour. But here's the thing they knew. Deep down they knew it was bad. They just couldn't stop. Because changing meant admitting you'd spent the last 50 years marinating in bacteria for no reason. So instead, they built a culture of denial. The stink became part of the mythos, the suffering, the piety, and the idea that washing too much could turn you into a heretic, a pleasure seeker, or worst of all, a foreigner. So how did people deal perfume? Not the kind that makes you smell like orchids and promises. Medieval perfume was intense, heavy, resinous, often made from animal glands, mould, or fermented herbs. People soaked their handkerchiefs in it, stuffed it into their hoods, even lined their coffins with it. Not because they wanted to smell good, but because they wanted to smell less bad. In the war against odour, it was a desperate losing battle. But it was all they had. The architecture adapted too. Houses had smoke holes not for ventilation, but because it masked the human funk. Churches burned incense non-stop, not for spiritual ambience, but because everyone kneeling in prayer had the hygiene of a landfill raccoon. Medieval street festivals, more like open-air gas chambers with dancing. Imagine a summer fair where no one has bathed since autumn, and now they're spinning in wool cloaks. That's the stink era. Ode to mortality. Even love letters changed. Poets stopped writing about beauty and started praising naturalness. One 14th century bard wrote a sonnet comparing his lover's unwashed hair to the earth after a rainstorm. Romantic, possibly. Realistic, probably not. But in a world where everyone reeked, you either embraced it or died alone. Medieval dating tip compliment her mildew, she'll swoon. And of course the church made sure everyone stayed guilty. Priests preached sermons against vanity, against lotions, against baths. They warned that to cleanse the body was to tempt the soul. Public bathhouses were accused of promoting lust. Communal bathing was linked to prostitution. Eventually, laws were passed banning bathhouses entirely. You couldn't even get clean if you wanted to. Congratulations, your sin now has a legal stench limit. And so the stink era roared on. Generations came and went in layers of dirt. Epidemics passed, empires fell, fashion changed, but the funk remained. From the knight in chainmail to the nun in layers of wool, everyone stank like they'd lost a bet with hygiene. And they wore that stink like a badge of honour declaration. I smell, therefore I am. It wasn't until the Renaissance, when science started poking its head out of the manure pile, that people began to ask, wait, what if we're supposed to bathe? It was a slow return to water, soap and sanity. But the centuries of olfactory trauma lingered, even as bathhouses reopened and doctors retracted their water. Poison theories, the cultural fear remained, because once you build an entire civilization around body odour, it's hard to pivot. So the next time someone tells you medieval people were just simple folk living in harmony with nature, remember this: they lived in harmony with stench. They feared soap. They outlawed bathing. They found ways to justify wearing the same tunic through a plague and a funeral. And through it all, they never stopped believing that dirt was divine. You don't just wash that kind of history off, but you should definitely try. If you've ever tried bathing a toddler, you already know it's a high-stakes wrestling match that ends with at least one person crying, usually both. Now imagine doing that in medieval Europe, only there's no soap, no bathtub, no towel, and the water might be cursed. Children weren't just little people. They were drowning liabilities and tunics. In a world where even adults feared water like it owed them back taxes, children were basically walking accidental death posters. First, let's establish the obvious medieval kids were left unsupervised. Not in the go play in the yard way. In the don't die while I'm harvesting wheat, giving birth and warding off demons way. Babies were swaddled until they resembled sweaty burritos. Toddlers were tied to chairs to stop them from crawling into the fire, and once they could walk, they were expected to follow adults into rivers, mills, and public streets filled with sewage and stray dogs. So when a kid fell into a water source, no one was shocked. It was Tuesday. The most common source of water-related child death: open wells. Wells were everywhere, often uncovered, slippery, and built at the exact height where a curious 6-year-old could lean over, drop a rock, and then follow it down like a very wet wish. Wells weren't protected with fences or lids. They were sacred and practical and terrifyingly deep. Parents warned their kids, of course, but medieval warnings went something like, "Don't go near the well, or the devil will pull you in, Effective, maybe. Traumatizing, definitely. Then there were rivers. Beautiful, flowing, silent death machines. Rivers were used for everything: washing clothes, fishing, dumping waste, baptizing babies, disposing of plague corpses, and yes, entertainment. Kids would play on the river banks, chase frogs, skip rocks. All good fun until little Henry slipped on some moss and got swept into the medieval spin cycle. No life jackets, no swimming lessons. Just a frantic mother, a lot of screaming, and possibly a priest yelling Latin at the water just in case. Bathing itself was a risk. The few times children were actually cleaned, it was usually in wooden tubs filled with lukewarm regret. The child might be slippery, restless, and squirming like a freshly caught eel. Add in soap made from animal fat and lye, and you've got a chemical burn waiting to happen. If the water was too hot, scalding. Too cold, pneumonia. If they cried during the bath, parents would often conclude the child was either possessed or just a difficult temperament, both of which could lead to a priest with a bucket of holy water and a deeply unfortunate afternoon. And speaking of holy water baptisms, sounds sweet and symbolic, right wrong. Baptisms were often done in open water or with full immersion in stone basins that looked like oversized bird baths in winter, by priests with shaky hands and the finesse of a stonemason. Stories exist of babies being dropped, slipping from fingers, or going blue from the cold before anyone noticed. If the baby coughed up water afterward, that's just the sin leaving. If they stopped breathing, God's will. Worst case, just try again with the next kid. Naming them Hope might help. Public bathhouses weren't much safer. When children were allowed in, which wasn't often, they were thrown into communal tubs full of strangers' bacteria and the vague possibility of syphilis. You had to keep one hand on your child and the other hand on your dignity, which was hard because the dignity had left the building the moment your naked kid peed in the same water an old man was soaking his gouty foot. If your child got sick afterward, you had a few options. 1. Herbs. 2. Prayer. 3. Letting them sweat it out. Or 4. Hoping they were the strong sibling. And don't forget medieval homes themselves. Most didn't have plumbing. If you needed water, you fetched it. Buckets were heavy, floors were slippery, and kids often carried their own. Imagine a 5-year-old lugging a bucket half his size across a dirt floor. It sloshes, he stumbles. Now he's wet, injured, and crying, which means someone yells at him and blames the devil for tripping him. Meanwhile, the water gets poured into the same pot used for bathing the baby and boiling vegetables. Congratulations, you've just invented salmonella stew. The irony, despite all this, children were seen as gifts from God, but very breakable gifts. Parents loved them when they weren't terrified of them. A kid who lived past 5 was basically a miracle, one who survived water-related disasters, a saint in the making. You'd think this would lead to safer practices, better supervision, child-sized life jackets maybe, but no. Instead, people blamed fate sin fairies, or the child itself for being too curious. There's even folklore about water spirits stealing children, Nixies, kelpies, river demons, legendary creatures who lured kids into ponds and lakes. Parents used these tales to keep children from playing near water, but let's be honest, they were just trying to explain why their 4th kid vanished downstream after trying to pet a swan. It's easier to say the Nixie took him than I blinked for 3 seconds, and medieval physics did the rest. So what did children learn from all this early on? They learned to fear water. It burned. It made them sick. It took their friends. They weren't taught how to swim, float, or dog paddle. They were taught how to avoid puddles and scream if their feet got wet. The idea that water could be enjoyable, a luxury for Renaissance paintings and future French kings. For everyone else, water was suspicious at best and predatory at worst. Some towns tried building public fountains. Great idea, except the spouts were often too high, and kids would climb on stone edges to reach them, only to fall face first into the trough. Others tried keeping kids away from water entirely until they needed them to fetch it, clean with it, or wash a pig in it. You were expected to be afraid of water and useful with it at the same time. No pressure, little medieval Timmy. Just don't die. As for infants, mothers bathed them rarely, if at all. If you did wash your baby, it was often as part of a religious rite. Otherwise, they were wiped down with cloth herbs or just left to dry off naturally like a sweaty loaf of bread. Baby powder didn't exist, but ashes and crushed flowers were sometimes used to mask the smell. Diapers were linen rags reused for days, and washed only when the pile reached critical mass. A baby's first real bath was usually their baptism. Second bath, maybe marriage. Of course, if your child did drown, the grieving process was medieval. You mourned, you cried, you prayed, and then you probably tried again. Birth rates were high because mortality rates were higher. Entire families lost children to wells, rivers, or contaminated bathwater. There were no lawsuits, no safety inspections, just the village gossip saying shouldn't have let little Thomas climb the mill wheel again. Justice was a shrug and a candle. Eventually, attitudes toward children and water began to change. Slowly, painfully. In the Renaissance, some parents began teaching basic swimming techniques. Public baths made a comeback. Cleanliness crept back into the conversation. But for centuries, water remained a threat, not a joy. Not a source of play. Just a cold, wet reminder that life was fragile, accidents were common, and sometimes even drinking could be fatal. So next time your child splashes in a pool with floaties, goggles, and a lifeguard watching, remember the tiny ghosts of medieval kids screaming, "What is this sorcery? They never learned to swim. They feared the tub. They drowned by existing. And they paved the way, stench, superstition, and all for your chlorinated joy." Swimming today is a wholesome summer pastime. A bit of cardio, a splash of joy, maybe some inflatable flamingos. But in the Middle Ages, swimming was not leisure. It was not sport. It was a suicidal ballet of shame, nakedness, and certain death. Because in medieval Europe, if you were seen swimming, chances were high you were either a criminal, a lunatic, or about to be arrested for sorcery. Let's get one thing straight. Medieval people could swim. Sort of. Some could. Fishermen, sailors, drowning survivors. But it wasn't considered a life skill. It was considered a suspicious hobby. Why would anyone voluntarily enter the same water used for disposing of animal intestine sewage and the occasional excommunicated heretic? If you enjoyed swimming, people assumed there was something wrong with you, or that you were French, which, depending on the region, was worse. The act of swimming required you to do something else equally horrifying to medieval minds: get naked. Clothing, after all, was sacred. It was your armour against temptation, your social ranking, your moral insulation. Removing it in public, even to avoid drowning, was like stripping your soul bare. You weren't just nude, you were unprotected against demons. That's right, skinny dipping was practically a spiritual death sentence. Better to sink modestly than float shamefully. Even when swimming was necessary, say a ferry capsized or you fell into the river during a beer-fueled kart race, it wasn't celebrated. If you made it out alive, you weren't applauded. You were interrogated. How did you not drown? Have you consorted with sea devils? Is your skin naturally buoyant because of a pact with Neptune? And God help you if you swam too well. Because that looked suspiciously like sorcery. And yes, swimming was linked to witchcraft. Women in particular were discouraged from even being near water. Too easy to imagine them dancing in rivers, calling to fish, whispering to frogs. So if a woman swam well, especially without panicking like a dying goose, people started whispering. And if she could swim and didn't float like a rock during a trial by water, Well, congratulations, she was now a confirmed witch, and also somehow still guilty because she didn't drown. You'd think the church would have promoted swimming baptism water all that spiritual cleanliness. But nope. By the High Middle Ages, many religious authorities warned against naked immersion outside of controlled rituals. Not because they feared drowning, but because they feared pleasure. Swimming felt good, moving freely in water. Relaxing, absolutely not. That was dangerously close to joy, and joy was the gateway drug to sin. Still, some people swam, usually in secret, often drunk. Peasants might wade in on hot days. Boys might dare each other to jump in the river right before getting pulled out by their mothers and beaten with wet reeds. It was like forbidden fun with bonus infections. Because the rivers weren't clean. You might survive the current only to walk home with typhoid between your toes and a mysterious fish parasite named Kevin. Clothing didn't help. Most medieval garments absorbed water like depression. Wool tunics, linen undershirts, leather belts, once wet, they turned into drowning harnesses. Swimming fully dressed was like doing a triathlon while wrapped in a wet carpet. But strip naked and you risked being arrested, mocked, or if unlucky, painted into the margins of a monk's illuminated manuscript titled Sinners and Their Sinful Nipples. Even military manuals warned about swimming. Not because it wasn't useful, Roman soldiers swam all the time, but because medieval armour weighed roughly the same as a small horse. Fall into a moat in full chainmail. That wasn't a tactical error. That was an immediate obituary. Knights didn't swim. Knights sank gloriously, heroically. While yelling, "Tell my squire I died clean," even though they hadn't bathed in 3 months. Curiously, there were swimming contests, rare ones, usually sponsored by nobles who had money to waste and peasants to risk. These were less Olympic Games and more survival auditions. Men would strip race across a lake and hope they didn't freeze drown or get fished out by accident. The winner earned a sack of grain. The losers earned hypothermia and the respect of absolutely no one. It was the medieval equivalent of Survivor, but with less sunscreen and more leeches. And we haven't even mentioned animal attacks. Rivers weren't just rivers, they were ecosystems, full of snapping eels, rats, leeches, and occasionally enraged swans. If drowning didn't kill you, the local fauna might. There are actual accounts of people being bitten by something mysterious in the water, then dying days later, presumably from infection curses, or the realization that they had no idea what a tetanus shot was. Let's not forget the plague angle. After centuries of associating water with disease, swimming became a double threat. Not only could you die from exposure, but you could catch something horrifying in the process. Bathing was already suspect. Immersing your full body in communal water, that was like injecting yourself with medieval bacteria on purpose. It was cleaner to stay dirty. Of course, children sometimes swam briefly before they were pulled out by their parents or the current. Accidental swimming, that is. Splashing around in the river during chores, falling off a log, or chasing a goat into a pond. If they survived, they were warned not to do it again. If they didn't, well, they probably became part of someone's cautionary tale about the dangers of floating too confidently. The few times swimming was officially encouraged, it was purely practical. Training for messengers, escaping burning buildings with moats, or crossing flooded fields when the oxen got bored. And even then, no one taught swimming. You just did it. Or you didn't. Lessons didn't exist. The best instruction you'd get was don't die, and don't take your pants off. And still, despite all this, some dared to enjoy the water. A rebellious few. A sunburnt monk on pilgrimage sneaking a dip in the stream when no one was looking. A bored noble's son trying to impress the ladies with his mediocre dog paddle. A fisherman who swam not for sport but because he dropped his net again, and this is the 4th time today, and God please help me. but they were the exception. For most of the Middle Ages, swimming was not leisure, not recreation, not sport. It was an accident, a scandal, a deeply questionable life choice. The water was for drinking, bad idea, washing risky and religious symbolism safe, as long as you didn't smile during it. Swimming in it. That was somewhere between a luxury and a moral failure. It wasn't until the Renaissance, when humanity rediscovered things like anatomy, logic, and basic joy, that swimming started to creep back into public life. The Italians predictably led the way, then the French, and finally the Germans, who decided it was okay to swim as long as no one enjoyed it too much. Eventually public pools were built, swimwear was invented, and people stopped assuming that buoyancy just witchcraft. So the next time you dive into a pool soak in a lake or swim half naked at a beach party without being arrested for sorcery, take a moment to appreciate your place in history. You are the living proof that people can evolve from being afraid of water to doing cannonballs in it. That swimming is no longer an act of moral depravity or aquatic rebellion, and that's progress, even if your dog paddle still looks a little bit cursed. Today, when your doctor says take care of yourself, they usually mean sleep more, eat less processed cheese, and maybe shower occasionally. But in the Middle Ages, medical advice was less take 2 pills and call me in the morning, and more don't bathe unless you're trying to die. Because for several hundred years, doctors believed that washing your body was dangerous, sinful, and borderline suicidal, and society listened. Because of course they did. What could go wrong? Let's be clear, medieval doctors weren't idiots. They were just confidently wrong. They had theories. So many theories. Most revolved around the 4 humours blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Every illness was caused by an imbalance of these mystical bodily juices, and every treatment involved purging, bleeding, or just waiting and hoping the humours sorted it out themselves. And water wasn't helpful. Water was chaotic. Why? Because of pores. Medieval physicians believed that the skin was filled with tiny invisible holes, gateways to the soul basically. When you bathed, warm water opened those pores, and once open, bad air, evil spirits, corrupted vapours, possibly the literal devil could sneak inside. So yes, technically bathing removed dirt. But it also made you spiritually vulnerable to being body snatched by a cold breeze. The logic was airtight in the same way an outhouse is airtight. If someone fell ill after bathing, the bath was blamed. Not the sewage in the streets. Not the rats throwing plague parties in the pantry. No. It was that single indulgent rinse from 6 weeks ago. That reckless splash of water had invited death to tea. And people believed it because doctors said so, and doctors wore robes and spoke Latin, which made them, unfortunately, very credible. Some even believed water weakened the blood. One 14th century medical manual explained that bathing draws the humours to the surface, making the body fragile and open to corruption. Sounds fancy, right? It was pseudoscience dipped in paranoia. Bathing wasn't just discouraged. It was a full-blown health hazard. You weren't being hygienic, you were flirting with your own mortality. Want to clean your feet? Better write a will first. Instead, doctors recommended alternatives: dry wiping, scraping with cloth, or rubbing oneself with vinegar-soaked rags. If you had wealth and time, maybe a perfumed oil. If you were poor, just a brisk dusting with a handful of herbs and hope. Physicians even advised that clothes should not be removed too often lest the body catch a chill through the linen gap, because apparently nudity caused pneumonia. Hospitals too follow this logic. Imagine checking into a medieval infirmary, probably with a cracked rib or a leaking lung, and being told we will not wash you. That would make things worse. Your treatment: leeches' prayers and a sponge bath with stale wine if you were lucky. In fact, some hospitals kept water strictly for cooking and cleaning wounds. Bathing patients was considered dangerous, excessive, or seductive. 3 adjectives you never want in your recovery plan. And then there were the bathhouse bans. Throughout the later Middle Ages, as plague spread and paranoia skyrocketed, public bathhouses were shut down by law. Not because people were dying from poor hygiene, but because authorities believed bathhouses were disease incubators and sex dens. In some towns, physicians lobbied to have them closed entirely, because nothing says public health like keep everyone dirty and celibate. The irony. Some medieval doctors were kind of right. Public bathhouses did spread disease, but not because of open pores, because they were communal cesspits of filth. The water wasn't changed often, people shared the same tubs. They bathed, sweated, coughed, and bled into the same wooden stew. So yes, disease spread. But not because water was evil, because people were soaking in it like dumplings without ever hitting a boil. But instead of blaming bad hygiene practices, doctors doubled down. The solution: eliminate bathing entirely. A clean person was just waiting to get sick. The real heroes were the crusty ones, the ones whose dirt had sealed their skin shut like protective armour. They were considered healthier because they retained their natural balance. That's right, being visibly greasy was a medical achievement. This medical gospel was preached from top to bottom. Royals followed it. Clergy preached it. Peasants adapted it. When the doctor said don't wash, the entire population responded with a unified unwashed shrug. And even as Europe started to stink so badly that cats left the continent voluntarily, the doctors held the line, this is fine. Eventually this advice began to change. Renaissance thinkers rediscovered Greek and Roman medical texts that gasp encouraged bathing. But even then, suspicion lingered. Some doctors insisted you could only bathe once a month and only in lukewarm water. Others said you had to immediately oil yourself afterward to seal the pores. Some even prescribed bathing, but with strict rules: no food beforehand, no cold wind after, and never ever bathe while menstruating. Because apparently that could tear a hole in your uterus and summon a thunderstorm. Even medical bathing came with strings attached. You had to add herbs, you had to boil the water, you had to drink a weird tonic afterward, and God forbid you smiled while doing it. Enjoying a bath made it recreational, and recreational was dangerously close to unholy. Cleanliness could only be tolerated if it was miserable. Meanwhile, other doctors pushed even stranger methods: sweating out disease in a hot room while not bathing, wrapping the sick in blankets to induce cleansing fevers, applying leeches to rebalance humours without ever rinsing the wound. One physician even suggested placing a live chicken under each armpit to draw out illness. Not directly related to bathing, but it paints the picture, and that picture smells foul. So what happened when someone did get clean? Best case, they were accused of vanity. Worst case, they were accused of witchcraft. If you showed up to town shiny, fragrant, and not covered in visible crust, people assumed you had powers, dangerous ones. No one just looked good in the 1300s. You were either enchanted, possessed, or French. Possibly all three. The only group allowed to bathe with semi-regularity midwives. But even then it was mostly to protect the baby, not the mother, and they still got their share of side-eye from the church. Washing too often implied you were trying to control life and death, something only God was allowed to do. So midwives bathed, then repented, then got blamed for any storm that happened within the next month. And through all of this, medieval people suffered. Skin diseases, lice infestations, infected wounds, rotting teeth, infected sweat glands, all preventable. All exacerbated by the idea that water was suspicious and soap was a gateway drug. But who were they to question? The doctor said, don't wash. So the next time your doctor tells you to rest, drink fluids, and wash your hands, maybe listen. Because once upon a time, someone in robes and a plague mask told the entire continent not to bathe. and Europe responded with a stink that echoed through the centuries. A weary traveller could stumble into a warm medieval bathhouse, peel off the layers of peasant funk and soak quietly in heated water while sighing, finally peace. But let's not get too cosy, because as soon as that traveller closed his eyes and relaxed, in walked 3 naked strangers, a lute player, and someone who definitely wasn't trained in massage but was very enthusiastic. Welcome to the bathhouse to brothel pipeline, where cleanliness wasn't next to godliness, it was next to lust, debauchery and awkward eye contact. The medieval bathhouse started out innocent enough, a practical invention, a place to rinse off the weak sins, both spiritual and bacterial. In early centuries, especially in towns that hadn't completely burned Roman knowledge like it was heresy, public baths were common, even admired. Hot rooms, cold plunges, scented herbs. Men and women would sometimes bathe separately, sometimes not. But hey, people needed to get clean right. Then someone had a brilliant idea. You know what would make this bath better? Boobs. Enter the bath attendant, or as she was increasingly known by the 13th century, the bather woman, which is exactly as subtle as it sounds. She helped you undress, scrubbed your back, rinsed your hair, and maybe offered a little extra service for an extra coin. Of course, no one talked about it, but everyone knew, because suddenly that family-friendly cleansing station became a medieval water park of sin. The transition didn't happen overnight. It started slowly, little flirtations, whispers a wink over the steam. But soon enough, bathhouses became the go-to spot not just for hygiene, but for hedonism. If you wanted to relax, you went to the river. If you wanted relaxation, you went to the bathhouse. In fact, so many sex workers operated out of public bathhouses that cities began passing laws to regulate it, which in typical medieval fashion meant they taxed the brothels and ignored the diseases. To be clear, not every bathhouse became a brothel, but enough did that the reputation stuck like wet linen. By the 14th century, the word stew didn't just mean soup, it was slang for a bathhouse. Specifically the kind of bathhouse where you're left with cleaner hair and a higher chance of catching something itchy. And thus stew houses were born. They were everywhere: London, Paris, Frankfurt, Prague. Some even had menus, not for food, for services. Bathhouse keepers, once humble soap slingers, became pimps with ladles. They managed staff, regulated time limits, and sometimes offered discounts for returning customers or nobility. Want a simple bath and back rub? That'll be 2 pence. Want company? That's 4. Want discretion? That costs extra. Want out of the building with your dignity intact? Sorry, that ship sank 2 towels ago. Naturally, the church was thrilled. By thrilled, I mean raging in Latin. Priests launched fiery sermons condemning the flesh pits of the devil. They warned that communal bathing opened more than pores, it opened temptation. Of course, many clerics still visited these establishments to investigate, and perhaps investigate again next Thursday, just to be sure, for research. The cities themselves were torn. On one hand, bathhouses were useful. They reduced lice-softened plague scabs and made people slightly less offensive to the nose. On the other hand, they were turning into soft-core water orgies. So what did officials do? Classic medieval solution: regulate sin instead of removing it. Many towns created red zones where bathhouses and brothels could operate legally as long as they paid taxes and didn't flaunt it too loudly near the cathedral. Meanwhile, the architecture got interesting. Bathhouses began including private rooms, decorative fountains, alcoves, and curtained nooks perfect for rest. Some offered wine, some offered music. One in Cologne advertised that it had 7 tubs and a harpist. Let that sink in. Someone was soaking in a medieval hot tub surrounded by candlelight and possibly syphilis, while a guy strummed out slow jams on a harp in the corner, like it was year-old Netflix and chill. And let's talk branding. Bathhouses couldn't advertise sex for sale directly, so they got creative. One offered a healing experience of full-body affection. Another promised to soften your skin and lift your spirit. Another said a lady awaits who knows the art of comfort. If you walked in expecting a good foot soak and walked out missing your virtue and half your coin purse that was on you, naturally people of means were frequent customers. Nobles, merchants, city officials. Some even rented out entire bathhouses for private parties. Stag nights before arranged marriages, initiation rituals for young apprentices, or just because they were bored and liked to watch their friends soak while wearing nothing but a feathered hat and a misplaced sense of pride. Because nothing screams social elite like public nudity and fermented wine. And what about the women working there? Many were there by choice or by lack of any better one. Some were former servants, widows, or simply women who figured out that scrubbing backs paid better than spinning wool. Others were trafficked, coerced, or forced by economic desperation. The line between bath attendant and sex worker blurred to invisibility. Some bathhouses even trained girls from adolescence, which means the medieval world managed to turn hygiene into human trafficking with steam. Eventually, the bubonic plague complicated things. Again, bathhouses were blamed as breeding grounds for disease because nothing says pandemic response like shutting down the only place where people occasionally wash themselves. Authorities closed the stews. Some were burned. Others were converted into prisons, warehouses, or sad empty fountains where people came to remember the sin. And just like that, the bathhouse boom deflated in a cloud of incense and regret, but the reputation never left. For centuries afterward, even as the Renaissance dawned and people started to rediscover soap bathhouses remained tainted. If someone said they'd just come from a bathhouse, it meant one of two things: they were either very clean or very guilty, sometimes both. Which is honestly a pretty accurate way to describe most human experiences. Eventually the concept of the bathhouse evolved. The brothel part got separated officially at least and spas took over, but the medieval stew house lives on in every seedy massage parlour with questionable signage, in every hotel that offers intimate packages, in every conversation that ends with "this was just a back rub, I swear." Because the truth is, the bathhouse to brothel pipeline wasn't just a medieval phenomenon. It was the inevitable collision of soap, steam and sin. And it taught us a powerful, steamy lesson. If you give people a hot tub and some privacy, they will absolutely turn it into a naked party. So the next time you step into a modern spa with cucumber water and ambient music, just remember you're walking on history. Damp, scandalous, slightly sticky history. And somewhere a 14th century monk is watching you exfoliate and whispering, "You're going to hell." If you think the peasants had it rough in medieval hygiene, wait until you get a whiff of royalty. Because behind the embroidered silks, gold-threaded tunics and mile-long capes were armpits that hadn't seen soap since the last solar eclipse. Medieval kings and queens may have ruled with iron fists, but when it came to bath time, those fists were clenched in fear. The idea of full-body bathing sent shivers down noble spines, and not the refreshing kind. Let's be clear, these people were not poor. They had access to hot water, perfumed oils, servants, scented linens, and imported soap from distant lands. But they also had access to something even more powerful, deeply rooted paranoia. Because if the royal physician said bathing might cause an imbalance in your humours, you listened. You didn't want to be the monarch who died because they dared to rinse their kneecaps. That's how empires crumble. Take King Louis XIV of France the Sun. King himself. He practically glowed with wealth, power and body odour. It's recorded that he only bathed twice in his life, once as a child and once under protest from a doctor. The man who built Versailles, who wore perfume so strong they could punch a nose into the next century, would rather die than step into a tub. He preferred a dry cleaning method, linen cloths, alcohol rubs, and being dusted with powders like a stale pastry. And he wasn't alone. Royalty across Europe avoided bathing like it was a rebellion in the plumbing. Queen Isabella of Castile reportedly claimed she only bathed twice in her life, once at birth and once before marriage. The irony, she ruled during the height of the Spanish Inquisition, a period obsessed with cleansing the soul but not the body. You could be burned at the stake for impure beliefs, but no one batted an eye if your hair had matted into a crown of despair. Even when nobles did bathe, it was an ordeal. First, someone had to heat the water, which meant several servants boiling huge vats over fire, hauling them to the bath chamber, and pouring them into a wooden tub the size of a depressed wine barrel. Then the water had to be scented, usually with rose petals, herbs, or chunks of citrus, because apparently if you were going to risk your life to wash, you might as well smell like fruit salad. And the tub itself, often a mobile luxury wheeled in and assemble like IKEA furniture minus instructions plus judgmental servants. The bather would disrobe behind a screen step in and sit silently while others poured water over them, sometimes using silver pitchers, sometimes with sheepish apologies. The king or queen wasn't alone, of course. There was always an entourage: bath attendants, physicians, food tasters, and possibly a lute player. Because nothing says relax like scrubbing your monarch's toes while being watched by 10 people and a guy tuning an instrument. But the paranoia persisted. Even those who bathed did so sparingly, always under medical supervision and never during the wrong phase of the moon. That could anger the elements. Royal doctors issued strict instructions. Avoid hot water. If you've eaten recently, don't bathe during menstruation, and never submerge your head. Your ears might absorb demons. Yes, that was a genuine concern. Medieval science now 60% sorcery-free. You'd think, with all the power and money, that kings would have figured out a way to enjoy cleanliness safely. But instead they doubled down on covering the stink, not removing it. That's why perfumes became the real power move. Royals wore multiple layers, each soaked in different fragrances. Gloves were soaked in rose water. Fans were scented with lavender. Even their horses smelled better than the average peasant. It was olfactory warfare. If you couldn't be clean, you could at least smell like someone who paid others to suffer for you. The palace staff. They suffered the most. Servants were tasked with cleaning linens, airing out garments, and if truly unlucky, emptying the chamber pots and mopping up whatever fell out of the royal folds. Some were even assigned the title groom of the stool, a polite way to say the king's poop butler. Their job wasn't just to clean, it was to monitor the king's digestion and note any changes. Because if your monarch had the runs, it was political. As for their hair, royals rarely washed it. Instead, they powdered it, braided it, or wore wigs, massive heat-trapping, lice-harbouring monuments to ego. Some wigs were made of real human hair, some were made of goat. All were sprayed with perfumes strong enough to make a warhorse weep. Underneath those wigs a scalp that hadn't seen daylight or lather in years, possibly decades, possibly never. Imagine sitting on a throne while your head slowly fermented. That's royal authority. Even more disturbing, bed sharing. Royal families often shared sleeping quarters with their children, siblings or courtiers, sometimes out of warmth, sometimes for status, sometimes because the bed was the only clean surface in the room, and that's generous. Everyone sweating under fur blankets, wrapped in unwashed nightclothes, dreaming of heresy and hygiene. Nothing says divine right to rule like night terrors induced by your uncle's foot rot. Of course there were exceptions. A few rulers were eccentrically hygienic. King John Thras of Portugal was known to bathe regularly once a month. Scandalous. Some Italian nobles embraced bathing in the Renaissance, influenced by Roman traditions and access to clean aqueducts. But they were mocked as vain. Too clean to be holy, people whispered. too fragrant to be trusted. Cleanliness might have been next to godliness, but only if you didn't smell like sandalwood while achieving it. The irony is that the people surrounding these royals, doctors, priests, advisors could have challenged the norms, but they didn't, because power breeds paranoia, and paranoia breeds bad medical advice passed down for generations. No one wanted to be the physician who said, "Your Majesty, perhaps a nice bath would help." That was career suicide. Best case, you were ignored. Worst case, you were jailed for conspiring with the plumbing. Even artworks lied. Royal portraits depicted clean skin, flawless robes, and glowing health. But the reality was rash-covered thighs, breath like fermented garlic, and a back rash named after the family crest. Poets sang of moonlit beauty while ladies itched under corsets. Ballads praised golden hair that hadn't been combed since last Pentecost. It was all illusion. A kingdom of stench wearing a powdered mask. And yet these kings ruled. These queens reigned. Somehow through plague war and hygiene that would shame a raccoon they endured. Not because they were clean, but because they were feared, respected, untouchable, and surrounded by a court too terrified to suggest maybe a sponge bath wouldn't bring down the monarchy. So the next time you light a scented candle, wash your hair, or clean your royal behind in a bidet, say a silent prayer for the medieval monarchs. In the modern world, clean drinking water is a human right. In the Middle Ages, it was more like a gamble with God. You didn't just have a drink. You rolled the dice on dysentery, cholera, or death by mystery foam. And while you might assume the solution would be regulating water sources, congratulations, that makes you more logical than most medieval municipalities, because medieval water laws were either non-existent, incomprehensible, or designed by people who thought bathing caused demons. Let's begin with the basics. Where did water come from? Springs, wells, streams, rain barrels. And if you were truly desperate, the nearest thing that looked wet and wasn't on fire. Rivers were common sources, but they were also communal toilets, garbage disposals, and plague delivery systems. So yes, people drank from them. Because what else were they going to do? Boil it. That was suspiciously scientific. Now there were laws, technically, but most were vague, outdated, or written in Latin so opaque it might as well have been spells. For example, in some towns it was illegal to pollute the town well, but perfectly acceptable to dump fish guts 6 feet away. A butcher could legally throw blood into a stream as long as it wasn't during a feast day. And many laws about water cleanliness were enforced only if the water belonged to the nobility. The peasants drink up peasants. May your immune systems be ever in your favour. Cities tried. Honestly, medieval London had dozens of edicts about waste disposal, many of which were ignored faster than you can say cholera fountain. People were forbidden from washing animal hides in public fountains, and then they did it anyway. There were rules against casting dung into the watercourses, but unless you were caught mid-throw, enforcement was spotty. And even then the punishment was usually a small fine or a very awkward public apology. Some towns had water wardens, actual officials, whose job was to inspect wells, pipes and aqueducts. Their effectiveness ranged from mildly helpful to guy who showed up once a month and then disappeared into the tavern. In theory, they could report illegal dumping. In practice, they were bribed with beer and pies. If someone died from bad water, it was blamed on the star's divine wrath, or your neighbour's sins, not the literal horse corpse floating upstream. There were also drinking rights. These were legal designations about who could access which water and when. In many rural villages, the lord of the manor controlled the spring. Peasants were allowed to use it, but only during certain hours, and only if they didn't muddy it with their peasant hands. Some towns had common wells for the public and noble wells for the fancy. If you drank from the wrong one, you weren't just breaking a law. You were committing treason by hydration. And then there was the wine loophole. Because water was so unsafe, people began drinking beer ale and diluted wine instead. Even children, even monks, even horses probably. Low-alcohol beer known as small beer was basically medieval Gatorade. The church promoted it, the crown taxed it, and doctors praised it as a healthy tonic because unlike water, it didn't come with bonus parasites. You could technically die from dehydration next to a river and be told to drink ale instead. Because at least the ale wasn't glowing green. Rural areas had their own issues. Wells were often hand-dug shallow and directly downhill from where everyone dumped their latrines. But because there were no germ theories, people thought the taste of the water determined its safety. If it was clear and not bitter, it was fine. If it made your mouth go numb, that was just a sign that the spirits were trying to talk to you. And by spirits we mean botulism. The irony, many medieval cultures had inherited Roman aqueduct technology. They had the blueprints, they had engineers, they had records of how to manage clean public water, and they ignored it in favour of superstition and cost-cutting. Clean water was too Roman, too pagan, better to rely on faith and dirt. Because if you died from contaminated water, clearly it was your time, or someone else's fault. The rich, of course, fared better. They had private wells, sometimes filtered through charcoal or cloth. Some even imported spring water in barrels because nothing screams, "I'm wealthy," like water with a travel itinerary. Nobles had servants tasked with checking water quality, which mostly involved looking at it and saying, "Seems fine." And if a noble did get sick from water, the doctor blamed the kitchen maid, the alignment of Mars, or the colour of their urine, not the dead pigeon in the cistern. And what about monasteries? Surely those holy places with their scrolls and quiet cloisters had better water. Sometimes, some monasteries built elaborate plumbing systems, including latrines with running water and channels to divert waste. Others decided that since sin was the real poison, water didn't need cleaning, it just needed blessing. So monks sprinkled holy water on the well and kept drinking from it, cholera be damned. Of course, public fountains were the pride of many towns. Stone spouts shaped like lions, saints, or mildly erotic mermaids, gushing water into communal basins. They looked glorious. They sounded soothing, but no one ever cleaned them, which meant you were drinking the same water as 50 other people, 12 oxen, and a guy who just washed his open wound in it. A medieval fountain was basically a disease smoothie with a fancy nozzle. Over time people started catching on sort of. Cities like Paris, Venice and Florence began building rudimentary filtration systems. Wooden pipes were replaced with stone ones. Wells were deepened. And water regulations became more common, though still rarely enforced. You might see a sign that said, "Do not foul the water," right next to a man defecating into it while singing a hymn. Progress is messy. Some towns even introduced water taxes, small fees collected to fund public fountains, aqueduct repairs and clean-up crews. But these taxes were deeply unpopular because nothing gets medieval people angrier than paying for something that isn't wine or firewood. So the systems crumbled, the fountains dried up, and the citizens went right back to drinking sadness, with a side of intestinal cramps. And then came the plagues. When pandemics hit, water quality became an afterthought. People were too busy praying bleeding or hiding in basements to think about filtration. But ironically, during plagues, water use increased for washing hands, cleaning wounds, and bathing the dead. It was the one time water laws were ignored in the right direction, and for a brief glorious moment people used water for something other than self-destruction. But it didn't last, because once the plague passed, people returned to their old habits. Drinking from canals, washing in slaughter streams, brushing their teeth with wine, and when someone suggested piping in clean water from a distant spring, the mayor probably said, Why we've already survived this long right before contracting giardia from the mayoral bird bath. So the next time you turn on a tap and clean drinkable parasite-free water pours out, you should weep. Weep for the peasants who died slurping mud, for the nobles who drank blessed diarrhea, for the monks who baptized themselves with crip juice. Water was life, but in the Middle Ages it was also death in a cup. If you've ever hesitated before dipping your toe into murky water, congratulations, you share a primal instinct with most medieval Europeans. But while you might be worried about stepping on something slimy, they were worried about being dragged to the underworld by a soggy demon with commitment issues. In the medieval mind, water didn't just harbour disease, it housed things. Things with claws, with teeth, with long damp fingers and questionable motives. Water to them was not peaceful. It wasn't soothing or cleansing. It was mystical, unstable, morally flexible. A mirror to other realms. The home of spirits, curses and enough soggy folklore to fill 1,000 cursed bathtubs. Every stream had a story. Every lake had a body count. And every river was either a holy relic or a demonic slip and slide. There was no middle ground. Start with the Nixie, a Germanic water spirit, sometimes a beautiful woman, sometimes a fishy abomination with the voice of a temptress and the ethics of a cat. Nixies lured men into the water by singing sweet songs, then drowned them for fun, for magic, or just because they could. People were genuinely afraid to go near rivers at dusk because the Nixie might be hungry. Medieval bedtime stories weren't about learning lessons, they were about learning to stay on land. Then there's the Kelpies from Scottish folklore. Shape-shifting water horses with skin like wet moss and eyes like tax collectors. They'd appear by rivers, lure children onto their backs, and then gallop straight into the water, drowning them before dinner. Sometimes they turned into handsome men, sometimes into long-haired women, always into death traps with hooves, and people believed in them. Whole villages would avoid ponds where a Kelpie was rumoured to live. Honestly smart. And don't even get started on Grindylows. These lovely nightmares came from English folklore long arms, green skin, snaggle teeth. Their job: wait silently in the shallows, grab children by the ankle and pull them under. That's it. That was the whole business model. Parents used them the way we use stranger danger, or if you don't brush your teeth, the dentist will know. Don't go near the pond, Timmy, or the Grindylow will eat your ears. Childhood Medieval Edition. Of course it wasn't just the Celts and Germans. Slavic myths gave us the Rusalka beautiful female spirits who haunted lakes and rivers. Sometimes they were the ghosts of women who died violently. Sometimes they were born of moonlight and vengeance. Either way, they lured men with flirtation, then drowned them with their hair. Medieval water spirits didn't need swords. They used bad life decisions and supernatural conditioner, but it wasn't all about murder. Sometimes water demons were administrative. In parts of France, people told stories of washerwomen ghosts eternally scrubbing bloodied clothes by moonlight. If you stumbled across them and tried to pass, they'd offer you a sheet. If you refused, they cursed you. If you accepted but didn't wring it out properly, they beat you with it. That's right. Haunted laundering with performance reviews. Your only hope: do the ghost laundry correctly, or die trying. And let's not forget water dragons. No, not the cool kind with wings and gold hordes. These were serpentine sludge monsters sleeping beneath swamps and stirring only to cause floods or suck down livestock. One popular theory for unexplained drownings: a dragon was angry. Another theory for spoiled crops after a flood: the dragon sneezed. Modern science calls it hydrology. Medieval people called it, he needs a virgin sacrifice and a better attitude. Even Christian Europe couldn't escape the soggy demons. The church was all too happy to co-opt local folklore and rebrand water spirits as fallen angels or unclean devils. Baptismal fonts were watched closely just in case a spirit tried to reverse baptize the baby into hell. Holy water had to be blessed constantly because if it sat too long it might become demon broth. Wells were exorcised. Springs were fenced. Because in their minds, Satan didn't just walk the earth, he swam in it. This fear translated into law, ritual and architecture. Wells were blessed every spring. Crosses were carved into the stones of fountains. Some cities held annual water blessings, where entire rivers were prayed over and sprinkled with sanctified herbs, basically spiritual mosquito repellent. In a few towns, priests were sent to walk along the banks and chant psalms like ghost-busting mole cops. If you thought your local creek had bad vibes, you called Father Gregory, and you brought incense. There were even gendered superstitions. Women were thought to be more vulnerable to water spirits because of their weaker spiritual constitution, read misogyny. A woman who drowned was often suspected of having been seduced by a river spirit or worse, seducing it herself. Men were considered stronger swimmers, but also more likely to challenge a water demon and lose. Either way, death by drowning was never just an accident. It was a moral failure or cosmic punishment. Animals weren't safe either. In many legends, livestock that drank from cursed streams either died, turned into monsters, or gave sour milk until someone sacrificed a chicken to the water. One folktale from Bohemia tells of a cow that turned inside out after licking a demon spring. The moral, don't drink from puddles that whisper, and never trust water that flows uphill. It's either a miracle or a setup. Of course, most of these stories were attempts to explain the horrible reality of medieval water, murky, disease-ridden, often lethal. When kids drowned, people didn't blame poor supervision, they blamed nixes. When floods ruined fields, they didn't blame poor planning, they blamed a vengeful river god. Mythology wasn't just storytelling. It was medieval risk management with ghosts and horse demons. And let's not pretend they didn't enjoy the fear. These stories were repeated, embellished, sung, and written into the margins of books by monks who probably hadn't bathed since Lent. Entire villages would gather at night staring into a dark lake and whisper about the woman who walked out of the water backwards. Was it a ghost, a drowned bride, a prank? No one cared. Fear kept people away from the water, and that in a time before fences and lifeguards worked. Eventually, as the Renaissance brought new thinking and basic plumbing belief in water demons faded. But it never vanished completely. Even today, some rural areas in Europe still whisper about cursed ponds. Some wells are avoided, some rivers are said to sing on foggy nights, and if you've ever gotten chills walking near a lake at dusk, you know the feeling. Something's watching, probably not a demon. But what if it is? So the next time you stand near a still pond, remember it wasn't just water to the medieval mind. It was a boundary between worlds, a mirror for the unknown, a liquid portal where logic gave up and folklore took over. They didn't fear water because it was dirty. They feared it because something was always waiting just beneath the surface. Let's take a breath. You've made it through 19 parts of filth, fear fungus folklore, and a parade of diseases that sound like they were invented during a bar fight. You've read about nobles who bathed less than your kitchen sponge peasants, who drank plague soup straight from the ditch, and physicians who declared war on soap. So now the question slams down like a bar of medieval lie. How did anyone actually survive? How did any human being make it out of this wet, cursed, unwashed fever dream long enough to spawn modern people who now complain when their oat milk isn't organic? The answer, of course, is they barely did. Life expectancy in the Middle Ages wasn't great. Depending on where and when you lived, you could expect to clock out around 30 to 40 years old. That's if you made it past childhood. Most didn't. Infant mortality was so high, parents basically named their kids Spare Number 2 and hoped for the best. But despite all the poop rivers and demon puddles, some people did make it. And not just survive, they thrived enough to keep the species going. Why, because humanity is weirdly durable. And medieval people were even weirder. Start with the obvious sheer numbers. People had lots of kids. Not because they were optimistic, but because they were statistically hedging their bets. If you had 9 children, you might end up with 3 who lived long enough to carry firewood and question authority. Fertility wasn't just a blessing, it was survival math. If the water kills half your household, you're going to need backup offspring. Also guts of steel. Centuries of exposure to contaminated water, rotten food, and mouldy cheese made medieval digestive systems into miniature war machines. Sure, people still died of food poisoning, but some developed ironclad stomachs, capable of downing ale mutton and 2-day-old stew with only minimal intestinal rebellion. These were the original champions of the 5-second rule, except it applied to everything, including dead birds. Then there's adaptation by ignorance. Sometimes not knowing how dangerous something is can weirdly protect you. Medieval folks weren't walking around in a constant state of germophobia. They didn't have Google. They weren't stress scrolling about microbiomes or E. coli outbreaks. They just lived through it, got sick, maybe died, or maybe didn't. And for some reason, that shrugging acceptance of chaos kept things going. Also worth noting, people avoided the worst water when they could. They weren't stupid. They didn't all just cannonball into plague ponds with open wounds. Many chose to drink ale or wine instead of water, not because they were party animals, but because it was actually safer. Low-alcohol drinks were often boiled or fermented, killing off some bacteria. So yes, even toddlers drank beer. Medieval kindergarten must have been a very mellow place. Let's also give credit to community survival. If someone found a clean spring, they shared the news. If a well-made people-sick word got around fast, usually in the form of rumours like, "The baker's boy drank from it and turned into a frog." Communities had long memories. They didn't understand microbiology, but they knew which puddles gave you the screaming trots. Local knowledge saved more lives than medicine ever did. Speaking of which, medicine didn't help much, but the human immune system did. The survivors, the ones who didn't die from the first 18 diseases they encountered, passed on some level of immunity. Their kids had stronger antibodies. Their kids' kids had even stronger ones. Eventually, medieval populations built up generational resistance to pathogens that would kill us in minutes. You think you're tough. Try drinking from a 14th century horse trough and see how long you last. Let's not forget accidental hygiene. People may not have bathed often, but they did things that unintentionally reduced risk. Boiling water for cooking, using vinegar to wipe surfaces, burning incense to purify the air and coincidentally repel insects, wearing layers that covered the skin. Yes, it trapped sweat, but also blocked bites and cuts. Even dirt under the nails created a barrier that modern dermatologists would call gross, but medieval peasants called flesh armour. And there was luck. Pure, stupid, celestial luck. Right place, right time, right puddle. Some people just didn't catch the disease. Some lived next to a clean stream while others drank rat broth. Some stepped over an open well. Others fell in. Life was a lottery. And if you made it to 40, you celebrated by buying a new goat and yelling, "I'm invincible," into the wind until it killed you. Religion also helped, not in the ways you'd think, but as a psychological crutch. When you live in constant fear of water demons and dying from soup, it helps to believe that suffering has meaning. Prayer ritual and belief in divine punishment may not have cured anyone, but they gave people a framework. And that mental stability sometimes translated into real behavioural rules, like fasting penance or avoiding cursed rivers that happen to be healthier, accidentally. Some people also just ran away. If your village well turned sour or your cousin exploded from swamp fever, you didn't always wait around for answers. People packed up and moved. To the hills, the forests, the next town over. This medieval version of a rage quitting allowed some to escape outbreaks entirely. Mobility, survival. If you couldn't outrun the disease, you could at least run faster than your neighbours. And let's not underestimate the power of low expectations. Modern humans panic over minor symptoms. Medieval humans woke up with a cough and said, well, better harvest the turnips while I still have lungs. They didn't expect long lives or good health or a single day without back pain. So when they survived something awful, they didn't ask how. They just called it a miracle and went back to work. That resilience, not knowledge, was what kept the species staggering forward. Over time, humanity figured it out. Slowly, painfully. People noticed that clean water led to fewer funerals. Cities invested in infrastructure. Science started yelling louder than the church. Soap got less terrifying. Bathhouses turned into spas. We traded water demons for water filters. And the odds of dying from a cup of tea went from 50-50 to you're probably fine. But don't let that fool you. The medieval fear of water left a stain on our collective psyche. It's in our language, our superstitions, our jokes. Every time someone says don't drink the tap water, you're echoing 1,000 years of ancestral trauma. Every boil water advisory is a whisper from the past. Every lukewarm shower that makes you gag is revenge from the ghost of a medieval barmaid who died in a stew pond. So how did they survive? They didn't always. But enough of them did by accident, by grit, by beer, by blind luck, and by blaming their illnesses on river goblins instead of hygiene. They passed on their stubbornness, their immune systems, their folklore, their weird, unearned confidence. And that's why you're here, reading this, clean, alive, probably hydrated. You are the descendant of people who drank actual death and said it could have been worse. So go ahead. Flush your toilet. Wash your hands. Drink that sparkling water without fear. But pour one out for the stink-covered, plague-kissed, river-cursed medieval survivors who walked so you could sip LaCroix in peace. They were disgusting. They were brave. And somehow they didn't all die.